in a small settlement along a Norwegian fjord during the year 1050, where smoke rises from a forge built into a hillside and snow blankets the surrounding forests. A man named Erik tends to the ancient work of drawing iron from stone. The craft has passed through his family for 3 generations, and his hands know the rhythms as naturally as his lungs know breathing. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to an 11th century Scandinavian settlement where we will follow Erik through the quiet, methodical work of iron smelting during the deep cold of winter. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Erik was 41 years old, with hands permanently marked by old burns and calloused from decades of handling tools and stone. His hair had turned silver at the temples, and his beard showed the same frosted color. The work had shaped him as surely as the iron he shaped, deliberate, steady, patient. The morning had arrived without fanfare, as mornings did in winter. The sky remained dim even when the sun had technically risen, and Erik made his way from his small dwelling to the forge, with the kind of unhurried certainty that came from having walked this path 10,000 times before. Snow crunched softly beneath his feet, and his breath created small clouds that dissolved into the colder air around him. The forge itself was a marvel of practical engineering. Carved partially into the hillside to retain warmth and protect from the wind, it featured thick stone walls that had been built by his grandfather and maintained by his father before him. The entrance faced away from the prevailing winds, and inside, the space held an easy familiarity. Every tool in its proper place, every area of the floor worn smooth by years of movement. Today's work would begin with preparation. Erik knelt before the stone pile where raw bog iron waited in its dull, rust-colored lumps. The ore came from the marshes that surrounded the settlement, iron that had leached from bedrock into water, where it gathered in layers like a gift from the earth itself. His people had learned centuries ago that this bog iron could be worked more easily than ore from deep mines, and it had become the foundation of their craft. He selected several pieces, turning them over in his hands with the kind of attention a scholar might give to ancient texts. His fingers could read the stone, noting its weight, its density, the subtle variations in color that suggested how much impurity it might contain. It was knowledge earned through decades of repetition, through countless hours of study and trial. His hands remembered what his mind did not need to consciously consider. The preparation area held several large flat stones, worn from use. Erik placed his selected ore pieces on the upper one and began the slow process of breaking them into smaller fragments. The work required no great force, just steady, measured strikes with a specialized hammer, each blow deliberate and placed with precision. The stone fragments tumbled onto the work surface, roughly thumb-sized pieces that would later journey into the fire. As he worked, the rhythm of the task settled over him like a familiar garment. Strike, listen to the stone's response, strike again. The sound was not loud or jarring, but rather a series of gentle taps that created their own kind of music, a quiet percussion that had accompanied every working morning of his adult life. He thought of his father performing this same preparation 40 years ago, and his father's father before that, reaching back through generations of iron workers, each one learning this rhythm from the generation before. The forge's interior began to warm as Erik prepared the workspace. He arranged his tools, the various hammers and tongs, the pokers and implements designed for specific tasks, in the order they would be needed. Beside them, he placed several large baskets woven from birch bark, each one holding different materials. One contained charcoal, dark and lightweight. Another held wood that had been specially prepared, dried and ready to burn. A third held the crushed bog ore, pieces small enough now for the smelting process. The winter light outside had shifted subtly, becoming slightly less dark. It was still early in the day, that strange neither morning nor midday time that characterized northern winters. Inside the forge, the warmth was beginning to accumulate, and Erik could feel the difference against his skin, not dramatic but noticeable. He paused for a moment, standing still, and simply allowed himself to notice the gradual gathering of heat, the way it seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. This was the meditation of his work, not the dramatic moment of molten metal, but these quiet preparations, the careful arrangement of materials, the methodical breaking of stone, the patient gathering of warmth. Each of these moments was essential, and each deserved full attention. He moved to the main hearth area now, where the smelting would take place. The hearth was a circular depression in the stone floor about waist high, lined with specialized clay that had been mixed years ago and hardened through countless fires. At the bottom sat layers of charcoal, already in place from the previous day's work, now cold and waiting to be brought back to life. Above the hearth hung a system of smoke channels, carefully constructed stone passages that drew smoke and gases upward and out through openings in the hillside, carrying the heat and air flow where it needed to go. These channels were the product of generations of refinement. They had to be precisely angled, or the draft would fail and the fire would not reach the necessary temperatures. His grandfather had spent 3 seasons perfecting the angles, testing and adjusting, until they worked in harmony with the northwesterly winds. Erik began layering materials into the hearth with careful precision. First, he arranged pieces of charcoal in a specific pattern, creating pathways for air to flow through the mass. Then came a layer of the crushed bog ore, distributed evenly across the charcoal. Then more charcoal, then ore again. This alternating pattern would continue until the hearth was filled to a carefully judged height. Too full and the materials would shift, too shallow and the smelting would not be effective. As he worked, his movements became almost ritualistic in their repetition. Handful of charcoal, spread it gently. Handful of ore, distribute it. Handful of charcoal again. The familiar weight of each material in his hands, the slight sound each made as it settled into place, the visual pattern emerging as the hearth filled, all of it created a state of profound, easy focus. The preparation work continued through the morning hours. When the hearth was properly layered, Erik turned his attention to other tasks. He inspected his bellows, a crucial tool fashioned from the hide of a young aurochs, stretched over a wooden frame with careful stitching. The leather remained supple from regular treatments with oil, and when he squeezed it gently to test its function, it responded with the proper whooshing sound, pushing air forward with steady, reliable pressure. The bellows would be essential once the fire began. The natural draft from the smoke channels would provide some air flow, but it would not be sufficient. Human effort, applied in steady, measured rhythm, would push air into the heart of the fire, raising temperatures to the point where iron would begin its transformation from stone into workable metal. He tested the connections where the bellows attached to the hearth, ensuring everything was secure. The leather-to-wood joints were wrapped with strips of cloth treated with pitch, creating a seal that would hold air without leaking. All of it was secure, all of it was ready. By the time Erik paused for a moment of rest, the sun had advanced through the sky to what passed for midday in this northern winter, a very subtle brightening that lasted only a few hours before the decline toward darkness would begin again. He stepped outside the forge for a moment, breathing in the colder air, feeling the contrast against his skin and in his lungs. The settlement beyond the forge was quiet. Smoke rose from other dwellings, including his own home some distance away where his wife, Margaret, was likely preparing the midday meal. The snow stretched across the landscape in its soft blanket, undisturbed except for the paths worn by daily movement. A few figures moved in the distance, going about the winter's necessary tasks. The forests that surrounded everything were magnificent in their white silence. Snow clung to the branches of pine and birch, creating patterns of stark beauty, the dark wood contrasting with the pale weight of snow. No birds were visible, though Erik knew they were there, somewhere in those depths, weathering the cold as they had learned to do across countless winters. He stood for only a few moments before returning inside the forge. The work called to him not with urgency, but with the kind of gentle persistence that characterized all his daily rhythms. There was more to prepare before the fire could be lit. There were always more preparations. The afternoon's light, such as it was, had already begun its shift toward the blue-gray tones that preceded evening. Erik gathered the materials that would kindle the fire, shavings of dry wood, prepared specifically for this purpose. These would be the first materials to burn, creating the initial heat before the larger fires were added. He arranged them at the base of the hearth's layered materials, creating a structure that would allow the flame to travel upward through the charcoal and ore. The work required precision. Too tight an arrangement and the fire would not breathe. Too loose and it would collapse into itself. His hands knew the proper spacing through decades of repetition. Everything was ready now. The hearth was prepared, the materials were layered, the kindling was arranged, the bellows were tested and functional, and the smoke channels were clear and ready to draw the heated air upward. Erik stood back for a moment, surveying the entire setup with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every element was in its proper place. The forge had grown quite warm during the preparations. The stone walls seemed to radiate a subtle coziness, and the air itself felt thick and safe. There was something deeply comforting about a space so thoroughly prepared, so organized with such clear intention. Everything had its purpose. Everything was ready. Erik moved to the small table where his fire-starting materials waited. Among them sat a piece of iron pyrite, a hard stone that would create sparks when struck properly. Beside it lay a bundle of the finest tinder, dried fungus collected from beneath birch bark, prepared specifically for catching the first spark and nurturing it into flame. He knelt before the hearth, positioning himself with the ease of long practice. The pyrite felt familiar in his hand, its weight and shape already known through countless repetitions. He struck it against a piece of steel with a measured motion, and immediately a spark fell onto the tinder. The spark caught with a tiny, almost invisible moment of ignition. Erik leaned forward, his breath steady and controlled, and gently blew on the nascent glow. The tinder began to smolder, the smoke rising in thin, pale threads. He continued with patient breath, not forcing but encouraging, allowing the heat to spread slowly through the fungal material. Within moments, a small flame appeared, orange and delicate, dancing with the motion of his breath. He had created fire perhaps 10,000 times in his life, and yet this moment never lost its particular beauty. From nothing but spark and breath, light and heat emerged. Carefully, Erik brought the small burning bundle of tinder to the kindling he had arranged in the hearth. The dry wood shavings caught almost immediately, the flame spreading upward through the carefully structured materials. The fire began to grow, but not rapidly or dramatically. Rather, it spread with the same steady, measured pace that characterized all of Erik's work. He watched the flames for a long moment, ensuring they were taking hold properly, that the fire was finding its way through the arranged materials as he had planned. The warmth began to increase noticeably. The smell of burning wood filled the forge, not acrid or unpleasant, but rich and earthy, a scent that meant the work was properly underway. Only when the fire had grown to the point where it was clearly established did Erik turn his attention to the bellows. He positioned himself beside the hearth, grasped the wooden handles of the bellows, and began the rhythmic work of pushing air into the fire. The bellows responded to his pressure with a deep, powerful whooshing sound. Air flowed into the hearth, striking the flames and causing them to flare and intensify. The heat increased immediately, becoming almost tangible in the forge's enclosed space. Erik maintained a steady rhythm, not rushed but deliberate and measured. Push, release, push, release. The ancient pattern that had powered fires in this place for 3 generations. As he worked the bellows, the fire began to transform the materials in the hearth. The charcoal grew hotter, its glow deepening from red to orange to a bright, almost white intensity. The ore particles began to move through their own transformation, heated beyond anything they had experienced in their long existence in the marshes. The iron compounds that had taken years to form in the bog were now being reconstituted, changed, prepared for their next existence. The smoke rising from the hearth grew thicker, and the channels above drew it upward with a sound like wind in a distant canyon. The entire system was working in harmony, the fire burning, the bellows pushing air, the channels drawing smoke, the stone walls radiating and reflecting the heat. Everything was functioning as it had been designed to function, each element supporting the others in the ancient dance of iron smelting. Erik's breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the bellows. In push, out release. His arms moved with the kind of ease that came from having performed this exact motion countless times. There was no strain in it, no sense of labor, but rather a meditation. His mind could drift into the comfortable space where body and task merged into a single, unified motion. Time moved differently during this phase of the work. The afternoon light had continued its slow decline, but inside the forge there was no day or night, only the constant glow of the fire, the steady rhythm of the bellows, the gradually increasing heat. The world beyond the forge walls seemed to fade into irrelevance. There was only this: the fire, the bellows, the iron in its transformation. After a time that might have been an hour or might have been much longer, Erik began to sense a change in the character of the fire. He had learned to read these subtle shifts through decades of practice. The flames were now burning with a particular intensity, and the heat had reached a critical threshold. The ore was responding. The iron was beginning to gather. He continued the bellows work, maintaining the steady rhythm, keeping the air flowing into the heart of the fire. His shoulders moved with the same measured pace. His breathing remained calm and even. There was no hurry, no sense of urgency. The iron would be ready when it was ready. Rushing would accomplish nothing. As the fire continued to burn with its brilliant intensity, Erik allowed his mind to settle into a deeply peaceful state. This was the true meditation of his work, not the preparation, though that had its own value, but this moment of sustaining the fire. He was not controlling the transformation. He was simply supporting it, providing the conditions that allowed the ancient elements to do their work. The iron knew how to transform itself. His role was merely to maintain the heat and the air flow. The warmth in the forge had become profound now. It radiated from the stone walls, from the hearth, from the very air itself. If a visitor had entered at this moment, they might have found it almost uncomfortably warm, but to Erik, it felt like being enveloped in safety. This was the temperature of his life's work. This was the environment in which iron was reborn. He shifted his weight slightly, continuing the bellows rhythm with his arms while keeping his lower body steady. The boots he wore, made from the hide of northern animals and lined with wool, protected his feet from the intense heat radiating from the floor. His clothing, too, was specifically chosen for this work. Layers of wool and linen that would allow him to work near the fire without being burned, yet would not restrict his movement. Every element of his preparation extended beyond the materials to himself. He had learned long ago that a craftsman must prepare himself as thoroughly as the hearth and materials. His body had to be ready for the work. His mind had to be settled. His breathing had to be calm. All of this was as important as the arrangement of charcoal and ore. The flames continued their bright dance, casting flickering shadows across the forge walls. The shadows moved with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, expanding and contracting with the motion of the flames, creating a constant, subtle shift in the visual landscape. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with decoration or ornamentation. It was the beauty of purpose fulfilled, of systems working in harmony. Eventually, as the afternoon continued its inevitable decline toward evening, Erik began to gradually reduce the pace of the bellows. The fire had reached the point where it would sustain itself for a time without additional air being forced through. He would resume the bellows work later, but for now, his arms could rest. He stepped back from the hearth, allowing his breathing to return to its normal pace. His arms felt pleasantly warm and slightly tired from the steady work. The rest they would now receive would be the sweetest kind, earned through hours of focused, meditative labor. The forge had become a space of complete warmth now. Every stone seemed to glow with accumulated heat. The air itself was thick and full, saturated with the smell of fire and iron and charcoal. It was the smell of transformation, the smell of work being done properly, the smell of a day well spent. Erik moved to a simple wooden bench positioned in one corner of the forge, a space where he often sat during these transitions between the active phases of the work. He settled onto it with a sigh of contentment, feeling his weight settle into the familiar wood, feeling the heat of the forge wrap around him. From this vantage point, he could see the entire hearth, the flames still burning with their brilliant intensity, the glow illuminating the space in shades of red and orange and gold. He could hear the quiet pop and crackle of the fire, the distant sound of wind outside, the soft whisper of smoke being drawn upward through the channels. This was the rhythm of his work, periods of active labor punctuated by moments of rest and observation. The iron was now in the process of transformation. Nothing more could be forced. The heat was doing its work, and time was the final ingredient that could not be rushed. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Margaret, who would be preparing the evening meal. She knew his schedule as well as he did. She would not expect him to return to the home until the day's major work phase was complete. She had learned long ago that iron smelting could not be interrupted by the regular rhythms of ordinary life. The fire had its own schedule, and the people who worked with fire had to learn to follow that schedule rather than impose their own. They had been married for 19 winters now, and in that time, Margaret had become as much a part of the iron-working world as Erik himself, even though she did not work the forge directly. She understood the patience required. She understood that the best meals were the ones eaten after the day's work was complete, when Erik could sit at their table fully present, his mind no longer divided between the task and his hunger. The bench beneath him seemed to cradle him gently, and Erik allowed his body to relax completely. His hands rested on his legs, palms down, still warm from the bellows work. His breathing had become very slow and very steady. The heat of the forge seemed to penetrate not just his skin, but something deeper, some part of his being that recognized and welcomed this familiar warmth. Time seemed to move more slowly during these rest periods. There was no urgency to it. The fire would continue to burn. The iron would continue to transform. And Erik would sit in this peaceful space, observing the work that his hands and his knowledge and his years of practice had set in motion. The light from the fire danced across the stone walls, creating constantly shifting patterns. If Erik had been inclined toward such thoughts, he might have noticed how the patterns resembled waves in a frozen pond, or the branches of trees, or the pathways of migration taken by creatures across the northern landscape. But he did not pursue such fanciful observations. He simply watched and breathed, and allowed the peace of the work to settle more deeply into him with each passing moment. Outside the forge, the winter afternoon continued its progression toward evening. The snow would soon begin to glow with the blue-white light of approaching dusk. The settlement beyond would be preparing for the quiet hours of night. But here, in this stone structure built into the hillside, the work continued in its ancient rhythm, unaffected by the passage of the sun or the turning of seasons. Erik's rest extended through the quiet transition between afternoon and evening. The fire in the hearth maintained its steady burn, the iron continuing its slow transformation deep within the layered materials. He remained on his bench, his posture settled and easy, his gaze following the gentle dance of the flames. As the light from outside began to shift toward the deeper blue-gray tones of approaching dusk, Erik rose from the bench with the unhurried movements of someone fully rested. His body felt ready for the next phase of work. He moved to a shelf carved into the forge wall where earthenware vessels held water, collected from the spring that ran near the settlement and stored in this cool space. He drank slowly, the water cold and clean against his throat. The contrast between the water's coolness and the forge's encompassing warmth was pleasant, neither shocking nor uncomfortable, but rather a gentle acknowledgement of the two different temperatures his body inhabited. When he had finished, he set the vessel aside and turned his attention back to the hearth. The fire had burned down somewhat from its earlier intensity, though it still glowed with a brilliant orange red at its heart. This was the expected pattern. The charcoal had consumed itself partially, and new material would need to be added to sustain the necessary heat. Erik moved to one of the prepared baskets and selected several pieces of charcoal, larger pieces this time, meant to burn longer and more steadily than the kindling. Before adding the new fuel, he used a long iron poker to gently shift the materials in the hearth, ensuring that the ore was being exposed to the heat evenly. The poker was an extension of his arm, familiar and responsive. He moved it with precision, shifting here, creating space there, all without disrupting the fundamental structure of the layered materials. The ore in the depths of the hearth was beginning to show signs of transformation. In the spaces where the poker had moved materials aside, Erik could see that the bog iron was taking on a different character. It was gathering, consolidating, beginning to form the spongy mass that would eventually become workable metal. The transformation that had seemed so distant this morning was now underway in earnest. He added the fresh charcoal carefully, distributing it across the surface of the hearth so that the air could flow around each piece. Then he picked up the bellows once more and resumed the rhythmic work of pushing air into the fire. The bellows whoosh returned, steady and measured, and the flames immediately intensified in response. The newly added charcoal caught and began to burn, and the overall heat in the forge increased noticeably. Erik maintained the familiar rhythm: push, release, push, release, his body moving with the automaticity of thousands of repetitions. The work continued as darkness fully settled outside the forge. There was no clock marking the hours, no external measure of time except the slow progression of the fire through its fuel and the gradual transformation of ore into iron. Erik worked by the light of the flames themselves, the firelight providing everything he needed to see what he was doing. The evening hours passed in this rhythm. Occasionally, he would pause the bellows work to check the hearth, to add more charcoal when needed, to adjust the materials with his poker. These pauses were brief. The work was relentless in its demands, yet never felt rushed or pressured. The fire required consistent attention, and Erik provided it with the same patient dedication he brought to every aspect of his craft. His mind settled into the deepest level of meditation now. The distinction between his body and the work had almost entirely dissolved. When his arms worked the bellows, it was not Erik deciding to move his arms. It was simply the motion that needed to happen, the motion that had always happened in this place, the motion that would continue to happen as long as the fire burned. Time became almost meaningless in this state. He was aware of the progression from evening into night, aware that the stars would now be visible above the settlement if one were to step outside, aware that Margaret would have finished her evening tasks and would be waiting for his return. But these awarenesses existed at the periphery of his consciousness. The center of his attention remained entirely focused on the fire, the ore, the transformation taking place in the depths of the hearth. It was during these hours of night work that the true magic of iron smelting revealed itself. Not magic in any supernatural sense, but the profound magic of understanding and skill and patience intersecting with the fundamental nature of materials. The bog iron, which had spent years gathering in the marshes, was now being reborn. The charcoal, which had been living trees in forests nearby, had given its essence to create the heat necessary for this transformation. The human will, Erik's knowledge, his skill, his determination, was providing the final element, the understanding of how to bring all these materials together. Near what would have been midnight if there had been a way to measure it precisely, Erik began to sense that the ore was approaching the moment of completion. The change was subtle, a shift in the character of the heat, a particular quality to the glow in the hearth's depths, a sense that conveyed itself through his skin and bones rather than through any visible change. He gradually reduced the intensity of the bellows work, allowing the fire to settle into a lower, steadier burn. This phase was crucial. The iron needed to cool slightly, to consolidate, to form the solid mass that would eventually be removed from the hearth and shaped into tools and weapons and implements. As the fire diminished to a gentle glow, Erik set aside the bellows and moved to prepare for the final phase of this day's work. He gathered several tools that would be needed for the removal and initial processing of the newly formed iron. Heavy tongs, designed to withstand extreme heat, long-handled scoops, containers of water positioned at safe distances from the work area. The forge had cooled somewhat from its earlier intense heat, though it remained profoundly warm. Erik's body, which had been working steadily through the evening and into the night, was warm as well, his skin flushed from the combination of exertion and the ambient temperature. He felt deeply alive, every muscle carrying the pleasant fatigue of meaningful work, every thought clear and focused. He waited now, not passively, but in the active state of readiness that characterized true craftsmanship. The iron would be ready when it was ready. To rush this moment would be to risk undoing all the careful work of the day. To wait too long would mean the iron would cool beyond the point where it could be properly worked. The intuition that guided him through this timing could not be learned from description or instruction. It could only be learned through repetition, through decades of standing in this forge, through the accumulation of sensory experience that allowed the body to know things the conscious mind could not articulate. And then, in a moment that was not noticeably different from the moments preceding it, Erik simply knew that the time had come. He moved with purpose now, gathering his tools and positioning himself carefully. Using the long tongs, he reached into the depths of the hearth and grasped the mass of transformed iron. It was still extremely hot, glowing with a dull red color, but it had solidified enough to be workable. He lifted it carefully from the hearth, bringing it out into the cooler air of the forge. The moment of removal was always striking, the transformation made visible. What had been scattered or particles, invisible in the depths of the layered materials, was now a solid mass. The bog iron, which had taken years to gather in the marshes, had become in the course of a single day something fundamentally new. It was a small mass, perhaps the size of his fist, and it was heavy, the density of iron manifesting itself in weight and substance. He placed it on a specially prepared stone surface, positioning it carefully so that the heat could radiate away gradually. The iron glowed in the darkness of the forge, a small beacon of transformation, still warm enough to be dangerous but cooling rapidly in the air. Erik stood back and simply observed it for a moment. This was always a moment worth witnessing, the proof that the process had worked, that the knowledge he carried in his hands and bones had guided the materials through their transformation successfully. Not every attempt resulted in usable iron. Weather could affect the process. The ore could vary in its composition. Equipment could fail. But today, the process worked. He began to clean the hearth now, removing the spent charcoal and ash, preparing it for the next cycle. The work was methodical and careful. Each piece of charcoal that had not fully burned could be saved for reuse. The ash would be spread on the fields in the spring, enriching the soil. Nothing was wasted. As he worked, the night outside continued its progression toward the hour before dawn. The temperature in the forge had dropped from its earlier intensity, though it remained warm and comfortable. The iron on the stone surface continued to cool, its glow gradually diminishing from red toward the darker tones of cooling metal. By the time Erik had completed the cleaning of the hearth and the organization of his materials, the transformed iron had cooled enough to be safely touched. He picked it up with his bare hand, the heat no longer painful but still noticeable, and examined it carefully. His fingers could read the texture, could sense the quality of the metal, and could assess whether the smelting had been successful. The iron was good. It would work well. Tomorrow, or perhaps over several days, he would begin the process of shaping this raw mass into something useful, perhaps a tool, perhaps part of a larger implement. But that work belonged to future days. For now, the smelting was complete. He set the iron aside in a safe place, positioned so that it could be easily found when he returned to the forge. Then he stood in the center of his workspace and surveyed everything. The cleaned hearth, the organized tools, the materials prepared and stored, the forge itself settling into the quiet of the night. The work was good. The day had been successful, and now it was time to rest. Erik extinguished the remaining flames in the hearth by covering it with dampened cloth, which would prevent any remaining coals from flaring up, while still allowing enough airflow that the fire would not be completely smothered. Then he moved to the entrance of the forge, where his cloak hung on a wooden peg. The night air struck him immediately as he stepped outside, cold, clean, shocking in its contrast to the warmth of the forge. The stars were visible overhead, scattered across the sky in their familiar patterns. The settlement was entirely dark and quiet, every dwelling closed against the night. Snow crunched beneath his feet as he began the walk toward his home. The path was familiar enough that he could navigate it even in the darkness. His body moved with the same unhurried pace that characterized all his movements, even now when he was tired from hours of work. There was no need to hurry. The night would not rush him. The stars would wait. His home was where it had always been, and Margaret would be there, ready with warmth and rest. As he walked, his mind finally began to release some of its intense focus. The meditation of the work was receding, and ordinary thought was returning. He found himself noticing small things, the particular quality of the starlight, the sound of wind in the distant forests, the cold that numbed his fingers even as the rest of his body remained warm from the forge. It had been a good day, the kind of day that justified the years of learning, the decades of practice, the commitment to a craft that asked for patience and skill and dedication. The bog iron had been transformed. The iron was ready for the next phase of its journey. And he, Erik, 41 years old with work-reddened hands and silver-touched hair, had guided that transformation through knowledge and skill and will. His home appeared ahead, a dark shape against the slightly less dark landscape. Smoke would have risen from its hearth earlier in the day, but the fire there would now be banked to coals, providing warmth throughout the night without requiring active tending. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him against the cold. The interior was dark and warm, and he could hear the soft breathing of Margaret from the sleeping platform. She would wake briefly to acknowledge his return, would perhaps reach out to touch his shoulder, but she would not demand conversation or attention. She understood that after the work of the forge, what a man needed most was silence and rest. Erik moved carefully through the darkness of his home, his feet knowing the path as well as they knew the forge. He removed his outer clothing, the heavy wool that had protected him from the forge's heat, and hung it near the entrance where it could air through the night. Margaret stirred as he settled onto the sleeping platform beside her, the straw-filled mattress shifting slightly under his weight. She reached out without fully waking, her hand finding his shoulder in the familiar gesture of acknowledgement. Her fingers were warm, and they rested there for only a moment before she settled back into sleep. Erik lay in the darkness, feeling the accumulated warmth of the day's work still radiating from his body. The contrast between the forge's intense heat and the relative coolness of the home was beginning to settle into a comfortable middle ground. His muscles, which had worked steadily through the evening and night, began to release their tension now that the labor had ended. Sleep, however, did not come immediately. Instead, his mind drifted through the events of the day, the preparation of materials, the careful layering of charcoal and ore, the moment when the fire had first caught, the hours of steady bellows work, and finally, the removal of the transformed iron from the hearth. Each moment held its own particular satisfaction. The work will continue tomorrow. There were always more tasks, more ore to process, more charcoal to prepare, more tools to maintain. But tonight, that work existed only in the periphery of his awareness. Tonight was for rest, for the body to recover, for sleep to gradually claim him as it had claimed countless nights before. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, and he could hear it moving through the settlement, finding the small gaps in the dwelling's construction and creating soft whistling sounds. The snow that covered everything would be undisturbed except for the paths worn by daily movement. By morning, new snow might have fallen, covering even those paths, preparing the landscape once again for the day's walking. Hours passed in this state of gradual descent toward deeper sleep. Margaret's breathing remained steady, and even beside him, the breathing of someone deeply rested and at peace. The sounds of the night continued their slow progression. The wind, the occasional creak of the dwelling's wooden frame as it settled, the distant howl of a wolf from the forests beyond the settlement. When dawn came, it came gradually, as it always did in the north during winter. The darkness did not suddenly become light, but rather shifted through shades of deep blue and gray, eventually arriving at the pale illumination that passed for morning in this season. Erik woke with the kind of gradual awareness that characterized his sleep, not a sudden jolt, but a slow return to consciousness, a gentle transition from the dream state back to the world of the waking. His body felt restored, the fatigue of the previous day's work having been replaced by the calm readiness that came with proper rest. Margaret was already awake, moving quietly about the home's interior. She had rebuilt the fire on the hearth, and smoke was rising through the opening in the roof that allowed it to escape. The smell of bread being prepared filled the small space, bread that had been shaped the previous evening and left to rise through the night, now ready for baking. The fire burned well, Margaret said, not as a question but as a statement. She had learned long ago to read her husband's mood and condition from small signs, the way he moved, the quality of his breathing, the light in his eyes. When Erik emerged from a successful day at the forge, he carried that success with him. It did, Erik confirmed, settling onto a bench near the hearth. The iron is good. Margaret nodded and returned her attention to the bread. She shaped the dough with practiced efficiency, forming it into loaves that would bake on stones placed in the fire's heat. Her movements were economical and sure, each action flowing naturally into the next. She had been preparing bread in this same way for 19 winters, and her hands knew the work as thoroughly as Erik's hands knew the forge. The morning meal was simple, bread still warm from the fire, cheese made from the previous summer's milk and stored in a cool cellar beneath the home, ale brewed from barley and herbs. They ate in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that came from years of shared life. There was no need for conversation. The presence of the other was enough. After the meal, Erik prepared to return to the forge. The day's work was waiting. The iron he had smelted needed to be worked, shaped into something more refined. But first, he would need to prepare materials, to organize his tools, to settle into the rhythm that would guide the day's labor. Margaret handed him a small cloth bundle as he was preparing to leave. Inside was bread and cheese, wrapped carefully for carrying. "You will need this before the work is finished," she said. It was not a question or a suggestion, but a simple statement of fact. She understood the rhythms of his work better than anyone except Erik himself. The morning air was sharp and clean as he stepped outside. Snow had indeed fallen during the night, not a large amount, but enough to cover the previous day's footprints, creating a fresh, unmarked landscape. The settlement was already stirring with activity. Smoke rose from multiple dwellings. Figures moved about, beginning the day's necessary tasks. The walk to the forge took Erik past several of these activities. He passed the dwelling where the settlement's weaver worked, and through the open entrance, he could see her at her loom, her fingers moving in the repetitive patterns that transformed wool into cloth. He passed the area where the leather worker processed hides, stretching them and treating them with preparations that would make them supple and durable. Each craft had its own rhythm, its own demands, its own particular beauty. But to Erik, the work of the ironsmith held a unique place. Iron was fundamental to all the other crafts. The weaver's loom had iron components. The leather worker's tools were made of iron or had iron edges. The builders used iron nails and hinges. Everything that the settlement created, it created partly through the work of the forge. The forge welcomed him as it always did. The familiar smell, the particular quality of the light that would eventually return as the fire was rebuilt. The arrangement of tools and materials that waited patiently for the day's work to begin. He set Margaret's bundle on a shelf and turned his attention to the iron he had created the previous day. The raw mass had cooled completely during the night. It was now a dull gray color, no longer glowing but carrying within it the potential for transformation. Erik picked it up and examined it again in the morning light, better light now than the firelight of the previous night allowed. The quality was good. The smelting had been successful. The iron was ready for the next phase. He positioned it on a specialized stone anvil, a piece of equipment that had been in his family for generations, shaped by countless impacts over decades of use. The surface was slightly curved, worn smooth by the countless times it had served as the base for shaping metal. But before beginning the serious shaping work, Erik needed to prepare himself. He moved to the water vessel and washed his hands and face, the cold water shocking and refreshing against his skin. Then he stood for a moment in the center of the forge, simply breathing, allowing his mind to settle into the state of focus that the day's work would require. The transformation of ore into raw iron, the work of the previous day, required one kind of attention, sustained, meditative, patient in its rhythm. The transformation of raw iron into finished tools required a different kind of attention, precise, responsive, requiring quick decisions and adjustments. Both demanded skill, but they demanded different facets of that skill. Erik selected his primary hammer from the array of tools arranged on a shelf. The hammer was well balanced, its head worn smooth by centuries of use, passed down from his grandfather to his father to himself. The handle was made from ash wood, carefully selected for its strength and flexibility. The weight of the hammer in his hand was deeply familiar, as comfortable as holding his own arm. He positioned the iron on the anvil and raised the hammer. For a moment, he simply held it there, feeling the balance, the weight, the rightness of the position. Then he brought the hammer down in a controlled, measured strike. The sound that resulted was clear and pure, a ringing tone that seemed to echo through the forge and out into the settlement beyond. It was not a violent sound, despite the force of the blow. It was the sound of purpose being fulfilled, of craft being practiced, of skill being applied to material transformation. The strike had changed the iron slightly, flattened it somewhat, begun the process of reshaping. Erik examined the result, noted where additional work was needed, and positioned the iron for the next strike. Then he raised the hammer again. This rhythm would continue through the day: strike, examine, reposition, strike again. Each blow would be deliberate and placed with precision. The hammer would gradually shape the raw iron into something more refined, more useful, more beautiful. The process could not be rushed. To force the iron to strike it when it was not ready, to apply excessive force, would result in breaking or cracking rather than shaping. The morning hours passed in this steady work. The forge gradually warmed as the work continued, though Erik had not yet rebuilt the major fire in the hearth. That would come later, when the preliminary shaping was complete and the iron would need to be reheated for final refinement. The sun, what little of it was visible in the winter sky, continued its slow arc toward the south. The settlement's activities continued around the forge, the sounds of other work, the occasional calling out of greetings or necessary information, the soft crunch of feet on snow. By midday, when Erik finally paused to eat the bread and cheese that Margaret had prepared, the raw iron had been transformed noticeably. What had been a rough, amorphous mass was beginning to take shape. The form was not yet complete, but the direction was clear. It would become a tool of some kind, perhaps an axe head or a tool for agricultural work. The specific final form would emerge gradually as the shaping continued. He sat on his familiar bench and ate slowly, noticing the way the bread had remained warm despite the morning's chill. Margaret's care was evident in every detail: the way the bundle had been wrapped, the particular cheese she had selected, the herbs she had mixed into the bread dough. These small attentions, accumulated over 19 winters, had created a foundation of comfort that supported all the other work of their lives. The afternoon would bring the more intensive work, the phase where the iron would be reheated and shaped further, where the hammer work would become more demanding, where concentration would need to be complete. But for now, Erik allowed himself this time of rest, this time of simple eating and simple observation. Beyond the forge entrance, the winter landscape stretched in its quiet beauty. The snow had begun to fall again, gently and slowly, in the kind of snowfall that would continue through the afternoon and evening, adding to the blanket that covered everything. By tomorrow morning, the footprints of today would be entirely covered once more. The work of the settlement would continue regardless of the weather. The forge would burn through the snowfall. The loom would continue its repetitive clicking. The leather would continue to be processed and shaped. All of it would continue because the work was essential, because these crafts were the foundation upon which human survival rested. And yet in this moment, sitting on a bench in a forge built into a hillside in northern Norway, eating bread made by his wife's hands, watching snow begin to fall outside the entrance, Erik felt a profound sense of peace. The work was demanding, yes, but it was also deeply satisfying. The materials responded to his knowledge and skill. The transformations were real and lasting. And when the day's work was complete, there was rest waiting, and the company of someone who understood the rhythms of his life. The afternoon's work was calling now, though not with urgency. There was time yet to finish the bread, to drink some ale, to allow the body a few more moments of rest. The iron would be ready when he was ready. The hammer would be waiting. The hammer had always been waiting, through countless days and countless projects, and it would continue to wait for as long as there was iron to shape and skill to guide the shaping. Erik set aside the empty bread cloth and rose from the bench with the unhurried movements that characterized all his actions. The afternoon light had shifted subtly, the sun's arc continuing its winter path across the southern sky. The snowfall outside had become steadier, creating a gentle curtain of white beyond the forge entrance. He turned his attention now to the hearth, preparing to rebuild the fire that would be necessary for the afternoon's more intensive shaping work. The raw iron, after being struck and shaped at room temperature, would eventually become too hard to work effectively. Heat would need to be applied to make it malleable again, to allow the hammer's blows to flow through the metal rather than simply striking against resistance. The preparation was methodical and familiar. Erik arranged fresh charcoal in the hearth's circular depression, creating the layered structure that would allow air to flow through and around the fuel. He added kindling, dry wood shavings arranged to catch the first spark. The system was simpler than yesterday's elaborate setup, designed for a shorter, more focused burn rather than the sustained heat of the bog iron smelting process. When everything was arranged, he produced his fire-starting materials, the pyrite and steel, the bundle of prepared tinder. The sparks came readily, caught in the tinder with the same small miracle that occurred every time. His breath coaxed the ember into flame, and he transferred the burning bundle to the arranged kindling. The fire caught and began to grow, spreading upward through the charcoal in a rhythm that seemed almost alive. The heat began to radiate outward, and the space of the forge transformed once more into a place of warmth and light. As the fire grew and stabilized, Erik positioned the shaped iron on a piece of metal resting partially in the heat, where it would gradually become warm enough to work again. The metal would need to reach a particular temperature, not the extreme intensity of the bog iron smelting, but hot enough that the hammer blows would shape it effectively rather than simply hardening it further. While waiting for the iron to reach working temperature, Erik turned to the maintenance of his tools. This was work that could have been postponed, could have been done at other times, but he did it now with the same care he applied to everything else. He examined each hammer, running his fingers along the handle, checking for any signs of splitting or weakness in the wood. He tested the balance of each one, ensuring that they remained true. The smaller hammers used for detail work were cleaned carefully, their heads wiped free of any dust or debris that might have accumulated. The larger hammers that were used for the primary shaping work were examined for any chips or damage to the striking surface. None were found. The tools had been well cared for, and they responded to that care by remaining in excellent condition. This attention to tools was not separate from the craft itself. It was part of the craft. A craftsman who neglected his tools would eventually find that his tools failed him at crucial moments. But a craftsman who cared for his tools with dedication would find that the tools served him faithfully, year after year, decade after decade. As Erik worked through the maintenance of his equipment, he found himself thinking about his son. The boy was 8 years old now, old enough to begin understanding the basics of the craft, old enough to start learning the kinds of things that could be taught through simple observation and explanation. Erik had not yet brought his son to the forge for serious instruction. That would come in another few years, when the child was old enough to understand the dangers and patient enough to learn through repetition. But already, the boy had shown interest. He had watched his father prepare for the work, had asked questions about what was happening, and had shown an intuitive understanding of cause and effect. This too was part of the craft, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The techniques, the understanding of materials, the patience required, the precision demanded, all of it would need to be passed on if it was to survive beyond Erik's own working years. His grandfather had taught his father. His father had taught him. And eventually, when the time was right, he would teach his son. The thought brought a quiet satisfaction. The work would continue. The knowledge would not be lost. The generations would be connected through the shared understanding of iron and fire and transformation. The iron had reached working temperature now. Erik could tell by the color it had taken on, a deep cherry red that indicated it was hot enough to be shaped, but not so hot that it would be damaged by the hammer's blows. He positioned it on the anvil once more and selected his primary hammer. The afternoon's work began in earnest now. Strike, examine, reposition, strike again. The rhythm was steady but more intense than the morning's work had been. The iron responded to each blow, gradually taking on more defined form. The shape that would eventually emerge was becoming clearer with each careful strike. As he worked, the forge filled with the sound of the hammer, the clear ringing tones that marked each carefully placed blow. The sound traveled beyond the forge entrance, out into the settlement, where it would have been recognized by anyone who heard it as the sound of skilled work being done. Different craftspeople made different sounds. The weaver's loom had its own particular rhythm of clicking and sliding sounds. The leather worker's tools made their own distinctive patterns. But the sound of the hammer on iron was unmistakable. The fire in the hearth continued to burn steadily, maintaining the heat that kept the iron workable. Occasionally, Erik would pause the hammer work to allow the iron to cool slightly, preventing it from becoming so hot that it would begin to break apart under the hammer's blows. These pauses were brief but necessary, part of the careful balance that effective shaping required. As the afternoon progressed, the form of the tool became increasingly clear. It was taking shape as an axe head, a tool that would be essential for the settlement's work, used for cutting wood for building, for firewood, for countless tasks that required the focused power of a sharp edge driven by human strength. The shaping required precision. The blade needed to be properly angled to be effective. The connection to the handle needed to be shaped in such a way that the tool would be balanced and responsive. Every aspect of the form mattered. A poorly shaped tool would not only be ineffective, it could be dangerous to whoever used it. Erik's hands and eyes and years of accumulated knowledge guided each strike. There was no conscious calculation happening at the level of conscious thought. His body knew what needed to be done. The hammer moved as it needed to move. The iron responded as it needed to respond. Evening was approaching now. The light from outside had shifted to the blue-gray tones that preceded the transition to night. Inside the forge, the firelight had become the primary source of illumination, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls and across Erik's face as he worked. A figure appeared in the forge entrance, silhouetted against the fading light outside. It was Erik's neighbor, a man named Soren who worked as a builder, crafting the wooden structures that housed the settlement's inhabitants. "The iron sounds good today," Soren called out, his voice clear enough to be heard over the sound of the hammer work, but not demanding immediate response. Erik paused mid-swing and turned toward his neighbor, the hammer held loosely in his hand. "It is shaping well," he confirmed. "An axe head. It will be ready in another day or two." Soren stepped fully into the forge, his eyes adjusting to the brightness of the firelight. He was a man of similar age to Erik, though his face was weathered differently, marked more by wind and sun than by the heat of forge work. "I came to ask if you might have thought about that handle I mentioned, for the pallet breaker." A pallet breaker was a specialized tool used in building work, a heavy implement with a shaped head that was useful for removing old timbers without damaging them beyond repair. It was exactly the kind of tool that required iron shaping, and it was exactly the kind of request that formed the basis of Erik's livelihood. "I have thought about it," Erik replied. "I believe I have prepared enough. I could begin the smelting within a few days if you are not in urgent need." "No urgent need," Soren assured him. "Spring is still months away. There is time." They discussed the particulars, the size and weight that Soren preferred, the specific shape that would work best for the tool's intended purpose. This too was part of the craft, the communication between maker and user, the understanding of what would actually be needed rather than what was simply assumed. When Soren departed, Erik returned to his hammer work, but the quality of his attention had shifted slightly. The afternoon's major shaping was complete. The axe head was now well enough defined that the remaining work could be done more gently, with smaller adjustments and refinements rather than dramatic transformations. The hammer strikes became lighter, more precise. The iron was beginning to cool naturally as the afternoon progressed toward evening, and Erik was guiding that cooling, allowing the tool to harden gradually into its final form. As darkness settled fully outside the forge, Erik began the process of finishing the work for the day. The axe head was positioned carefully, resting on a stone surface where it could cool completely through the night. Tomorrow, final refinement would be possible, perhaps sharpening the blade, perhaps making final adjustments to ensure the tool's perfect balance. The fire in the hearth was allowed to burn down, the flames gradually diminishing as the charcoal consumed itself. Erik did not rush this process. The slow cooling of the fire matched the slow cooling of the iron, everything moving in synchrony, everything aligned with natural rhythms. When the fire had burned down to embers, he used the damp cloth technique to bank the coals, allowing just enough air flow that they would not be completely extinguished but would not flare up during the night. Tomorrow, when he returned, the coals would still contain enough heat that starting the day's new fire would be simple. Just the addition of new charcoal and kindling would reignite the flames. The forge fell into the quiet that came when the work was complete. The space was still warm, but the intense heat of the working hours had dissipated. The tools were cleaned and organized. The materials were arranged for the next day's work. Everything was in order. Everything was ready. Erik stood for a moment in the center of his workspace, experiencing the deep satisfaction that came from a day well spent. The axe head was nearly complete. The order from Soren would provide work for the coming days and weeks. The apprenticeship of his son was approaching, not too distant now. The work continued. The craft continued. The generations would continue. He extinguished the remaining light by ensuring the forge entrance was properly sealed against the night, then stepped outside into the cold darkness. The settlement was quiet. Most of its inhabitants already settled into their homes for the evening. The snow had continued to fall steadily, creating a thick blanket across everything. The walk home took him through this quiet landscape, his feet finding the familiar path almost without conscious direction. The stars were beginning to emerge in the sky, though clouds obscured most of them. The wind had settled into a gentle breeze rather than the more forceful gusts of earlier. His home appeared ahead, and he could see light flickering from the entrance. Margaret had kept the fire burning, waiting for his return. The warmth and welcome that awaited inside were as much a part of his day's completion as the careful work of shaping iron had been. Erik stepped through the entrance of his home, and the warmth enveloped him immediately. Margaret was seated near the hearth, working wool with a spindle, the repetitive motion that transformed raw fleece into thread for weaving or other purposes. She looked up as he entered, her hands continuing their work without pause. "The axe head is nearly finished," she asked, though it was more a confirmation than a question. She had learned to read her husband's state after years of shared life, the satisfaction evident in his movements, the particular quality of his breathing after a successful day's work. "Nearly," Erik confirmed, hanging his outer clothing near the entrance. "Another day will complete it, and I have received an order from Soren, a pallet breaker tool. The work continues." Margaret nodded and set aside her spinning. She moved to where a pot had been warming near the fire's edge, and she began to prepare the evening meal, a pottage made from dried vegetables and herbs, thickened with grain. The smell was rich and comforting, having simmered throughout the day while Erik worked. They ate together in the comfortable silence that characterized their evenings. The pottage was warm and nourishing, exactly what a body tired from physical labor needed. Beside the pot sat bread, different from the morning's bread, this one denser and more substantial, baked the previous day and kept wrapped to maintain its texture. "Your son asked about the forge again today," Margaret said as they ate. "He wanted to know how long before you would teach him the work." Erik considered this, chewing slowly. His son was still young, but not impossibly young. In another year or two, the boy would be ready for the first lessons. Tell him that when the snow melts and spring comes, we will begin. There is time yet for him to grow stronger, and there is always more knowledge he needs to gather before the forge work begins. He will be pleased to know there is a time set, Margaret said. Children need to understand that things they wait for will eventually arrive. After the meal, they settled into the evening's quieter rhythms. Margaret returned to her spinning, the rhythmic motion of her hands transforming fleece into thread. Erik cleaned and maintained some of the smaller tools he had brought home, work that was less demanding than the forge work but still required attention and care. The fire on the home's hearth crackled softly, its warmth radiating through the small space. Outside, the night continued its progression. The snow had stopped falling, and the wind had settled into a calm stillness. The settlement slept, most of its inhabitants already resting, preparing for the next day's work. As the evening deepened, Erik found his thoughts drifting to the larger patterns of his life. He is 41 years old now. His hands bore the marks of 2 decades of forge work, the burns, the calluses, the permanent staining from iron oxide and charcoal. He was not old, but he was no longer young. The years were accumulating. Yet the work continued to feel fresh in a way. Each piece of iron was different. Each project brought its own particular challenges and satisfactions. The axe head he was completing would be used by someone in the settlement for work that he would never directly witness. The pallet breaker for Soren would serve the builder's craft, enabling work that would in turn create structures that would shelter people for years. This was the hidden satisfaction of the craft, the understanding that the tools being created would outlast the maker. The axe head might last for generations, might be passed from one user to another, might eventually be melted down and reforged into something new, but it would persist. The work would persist through the tool. By the time full night had settled, Erik was ready for sleep. The day's labor had tired his body pleasantly, the kind of tiredness that came from meaningful work well done. He and Margaret settled onto their sleeping platform, the warmth of the fire at a safe distance, the blankets heavy and comfortable around them. Sleep came quickly and deeply, the kind of sleep that required no transition, no conscious descent into unconsciousness. One moment he was aware of lying in the darkness. The next moment morning light was filtering through the spaces in the dwelling's construction. The next day began much as the previous day had, Margaret preparing bread and cheese, Erik eating slowly. The two of them moving through the morning's routines with the coordination that came from 19 winters of shared life. The snowfall had continued through the night, covering everything once again with a fresh layer of white. The walk to the forge took Erik through the settlement's waking activities. The day was clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that brought a particular clarity to everything. The settlement's inhabitants were beginning their day's work, smoke rising from hearths, figures moving about with purpose, the various crafts beginning their daily rhythms. At the forge, Erik found everything in the state he had left it. The axe head rested where he had positioned it, cooled completely now, solid and permanent in its form. The banked coals in the hearth still held enough heat that adding fresh charcoal would quickly reignite the flames. He spent the morning on the final refinement of the axe head. The work was delicate and precise, sharpening the blade to an edge that would be effective but not so sharp that it would be brittle, ensuring that the connection between blade and handle socket was perfect, making small adjustments that would ensure the tool would balance properly when used. The hammer work was lighter now, the strikes smaller and more carefully considered. The iron was no longer being dramatically reshaped, but rather refined, perfected, brought to its final state. It was the kind of work that required as much attention and skill as the earlier shaping, though it was less physically demanding. By midday, the axe head was complete. Erik examined it carefully, turning it in his hands, feeling its balance, testing the sharpness of the blade with caution. It was good work. The iron was of high quality, the shaping was precise. The tool would serve its user well for many years. He set the finished tool aside and began the process of preparing the space for Søren's pallet breaker work. This would require another bog iron smelting process, different from the simpler work of reshaping already smelted iron. The raw ore would need to be gathered, prepared, and transformed through heat. The afternoon was spent gathering materials. Erik made his way to the marshes that lay beyond the settlement, where the bog iron was accessible. The work of gathering was methodical and unhurried, selecting pieces of ore that showed promise, accumulating them in baskets made for the purpose, carrying them back to the forge. The bog iron lay partially exposed in the soft ground of the marshes, having accumulated through years of natural processes. The marshes were beautiful in their own way, despite the cold, the patterns of water and ice, the sparse vegetation that could survive in such wet conditions, the sense of ancient processes slowly unfolding beneath the surface. As Erik gathered the ore, his mind settled into the peaceful state that accompanied physical work that did not require intense concentration. His hands selected the materials. His body moved through the gathering motions, but his consciousness was free to wander through larger thoughts and observations. He thought about his son, about the teaching that would eventually come. The boy would need to learn not just the techniques of the forge work, but the deeper understanding, the way materials responded, the patience required, the precision demanded. It could not be rushed. True craft knowledge could only be acquired through repetition and guidance over time. He thought about Søren, about the various members of the settlement and their different crafts. Each person was essential to the survival and functioning of the community. The weaver, the leather worker, the builder, the farmer, the blacksmith, all of them dependent on each other, all of them contributing their skills to the whole. It was a beautiful system in its way, each person understanding their role and fulfilling it with dedication. By the time the afternoon was advanced, Erik had gathered sufficient ore for the coming smelting work. The baskets were heavy with the material, and he made several trips carrying them back to the forge, positioning them in the storage area where they would be ready for the next day's work. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when he completed the final organization of materials. The forge was ready now for the next phase of work. the smelting of raw ore that would transform it into usable iron for the pallet breaker project. He took a moment to stand in the center of the forge, surveying everything. The finished axe head awaited collection by whoever had commissioned it, or would remain in the settlement if no specific commission had been made, available for use by anyone who needed such a tool. The materials for the new project were gathered and organized. The tools were clean and ready. The space was in perfect order. The work of the craft was never truly finished. Even as one project moved toward completion, the next project was beginning. Even as tools were created, they would eventually be used, worn, and need replacement. The cycle continued endlessly, generation after generation. As evening approached, Erik made his way back home through the quiet settlement. The day had been productive but less physically demanding than forge work days. Less heat, less intense concentration, but valuable work nonetheless. The gathering of materials was as essential as the shaping of them. Margaret had prepared a simpler meal this evening, bread and cheese and dried fruit, the kind of meal that did not require lengthy preparation. She had been busy with other tasks, spinning had progressed, and she had begun the process of preparing wool for weaving, a task that would continue over the coming weeks. "Soren stopped by while you were out," Margaret said as they ate. "He asked when the pallet breaker might be ready. I told him it would be several days at least." "That is accurate," Erik confirmed. "The ore needs to be smelted, a full day's work, and then the shaping will require additional time. But I will have it completed by next week if all goes well." After the meal, they settled into the evening once more. The pattern was becoming evident now. The days of work followed by evenings of relative rest, the rhythms of the seasons underlying everything, the slow progression of projects and completion. As Erik lay on the sleeping platform that night with Margaret beside him and the fire providing warmth and gentle light, he felt a deep contentment settle over him. The work was good. The craft was being practiced well. The knowledge was accumulating and would eventually be passed on. The tools he created would outlast him. The iron would continue to be worked and reworked, generation after generation. This was enough. This was more than enough. This was the foundation upon which a meaningful life could be built. Morning arrived with the kind of quiet clarity that came after a night of stillness. Erik woke before Margaret, as was his custom, and lay for a moment listening to the sounds of the settlement beginning to stir. A rooster called in the distance. Smoke would soon begin rising from hearths as fires were rekindled. The day was preparing itself to receive the activities of its inhabitants. He rose carefully so as not to disturb Margaret, who still slept deeply. The cold of the morning air was sharp against his skin as he moved about the dwelling, preparing himself for the day ahead. His clothing had been carefully arranged near the fire's warmth, and he dressed methodically, each layer adding its contribution to his protection against the winter's chill. By the time Margaret began to wake, Erik had already kindled the morning's fire and the space was warming. She rose and moved to the hearth, beginning the familiar work of preparing the day's first meal. They had developed these routines over nearly 2 decades together, each person knowing what needed to be done, each contributing their part without need for discussion or coordination. The bread Margaret had prepared the previous day was broken into pieces and placed in bowls, then covered with warm milk that had been kept cool through the night in a cellar beneath the dwelling. The milk would warm the bread and create a simple but satisfying meal. Alongside this, there was cheese and a drink of weak ale, not strong enough to intoxicate, but brewed with herbs that aided digestion and provided nourishment. "Today begins the smelting work," Erik said as they ate. It was not information Margaret needed. She understood her husband's schedule as well as her own, but rather a kind of statement of intention, a way of marking the significance of the day that was beginning. "Will you need anything special prepared?" Margaret asked. She had learned over the years that certain foods and preparations were more useful on heavy labor days than others. "As you always prepare," Erik replied. "Nothing special is needed. Your care is always sufficient." The walk to the forge took longer this morning because Erik stopped at several points to gather materials that would be needed for the smelting. He collected birch bark for creating containers, wood that had been specially prepared and dried, and other materials that the work would require. By the time he reached the forge, the morning was well advanced and the sun, what little of it was visible in the winter sky, was approaching its highest point. The preparation for bog iron smelting was extensive. Unlike the simpler work of reshaping already forged iron, this process required recreating the transformation from raw ore to workable metal. The stakes were higher. It was possible to fail, to invest an entire day's work and emerge with nothing usable. This risk was part of what made the work so demanding and, in its way, so satisfying when it succeeded. Erik began by creating the clay mixture that would line the hearth. The clay came from a specific location beyond the settlement, a place where the earth held the right composition to withstand extreme heat without cracking. The clay was mixed with charcoal dust and water, creating a paste that was then applied carefully to the hearth's interior surfaces. This lining would last for several smelting cycles before needing replacement. As he worked on the clay lining, his mind settled into the meditative state that accompanied preparation. The work of the hands was methodical and did not require intense concentration, allowing his consciousness to expand and observe larger patterns. He thought about the day ahead, the hours of sustained work, the heat that would accumulate, the transformation that would gradually take place in the depths of the hearth. He thought about Soren waiting for the pallet breaker tool, about his son who would eventually learn this work, about his grandfather who had perfected these same techniques generations ago. The clay lining was complete by early afternoon. It needed to dry somewhat before use, and Erik used this time to gather and organize the materials that would be layered into the hearth. The charcoal was selected carefully, pieces of the right size and density, separated into baskets so they could be easily accessed during the smelting work. The ore was examined piece by piece, sorted by quality and size, prepared for its transformation. As the afternoon light began its shift toward evening, Erik permitted himself a period of rest. He sat on his familiar bench, eating the bread and cheese that Margaret had prepared, drinking water from the vessel by the entrance. His hands, though they had been working steadily, showed no fatigue. The work had been gentle compared to the intensive hammer work of the previous days. The evening was approaching now, and this was the moment when the smelting would need to begin. It was essential that the fire be started at the right time. The transformation of ore required hours of sustained heat and attention, and Erik wanted to begin this work at a point when he could continue through the night without the day's accumulated fatigue making concentration difficult. He positioned everything one final time, ensuring that all materials were exactly where they needed to be. They gathered ore, the charcoal in its designated baskets, the bellows tested and functional. The poker and other implements are arranged within easy reach. The water vessels positioned safely. Everything is ready. Then, as the last light of day was fading from the sky, Erik created the initial spark that would begin the fire. The process was now familiar beyond counting. Spark to tinder, tinder to kindling, kindling to charcoal. The fire was born and began to grow, spreading upward through the materials he had arranged. Once the fire was established, he began the careful work of layering ore and charcoal into the hearth. The alternating pattern, ore, charcoal, filled the space gradually, creating the structure through which air and heat would flow. His movements were precise and measured, each handful of material placed with attention. As darkness settled fully outside the forge, the interior was illuminated entirely by firelight. The world beyond the entrance ceased to exist in any meaningful way. There was only this: the fire, the heat, the slowly accumulating materials being transformed by temperature and air and time. The bellows work began, and with it came the deepest level of the meditative state that characterized the forge work. Erik's arms moved in their steady rhythm, push, release, while his mind entered that space of profound stillness where individual identity seemed to dissolve into the work itself. The fire grew hotter. The ore began its gradual transformation. The charcoal burned and new charcoal was added. The bellows continued their rhythm. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual progression of the fire's intensity and the subtle changes in the quality of the heat. Sometime in what would have been the deep night, if there had been a way to measure it except by the body's internal sense of time, Erik sensed that a crucial threshold was being approached. The ore was beginning to gather, to consolidate, to move toward that state of transformation where it would become workable iron. He maintained the bellows work, pushing air into the heart of the fire with the same steady rhythm he had maintained for hours. His shoulders continued their motion. His breathing remained calm and measured. His body knew what to do. His mind was simply present, observing, allowing the ancient process to unfold as it had for countless generations before him. The transformation continued through what would eventually become the early morning hours, though inside the forge, there was no distinction between night and day, no measurement of time except the progress of the work. Erik worked, rested, and worked again. He added new charcoal. He manipulated the materials with his poker. He maintained the bellows rhythm. He observed the gradual intensification of the heat and the glow of the fire. And then, in a moment that was not noticeably different from the many moments preceding it, he knew that the work was complete. The ore had transformed. The iron was ready. The process that had begun with raw bog iron, that shapeless, humble material gathered from the marshes, had resulted in the creation of something new and useful and permanent. He gradually reduced the intensity of the bellows work, allowing the fire to settle into a lower burn. The heat would need to decrease somewhat, allowing the transformed iron to cool and consolidate before it could be removed. The process could not be rushed now, any more than it could be rushed at any other stage. As the intensity of the heat diminished, a profound tiredness began to make itself known in Erik's body. The hours of sustained physical work, not dramatically intense, but requiring constant attention and effort, had accumulated. His shoulders ached pleasantly. His hands were warm and tired. His mind was beginning to emerge from the deepest meditative state into a more ordinary consciousness. The fire continued to burn at a steady, moderate level. Erik moved to his bench and settled onto it, allowing his body to rest while remaining alert enough to observe the hearth and know when the next stage of the work would need to begin. The interior of the forge remained profoundly warm. The stone walls glowed with accumulated heat. The air itself seemed thick and full, saturated with the smell of fire and iron and charcoal. It was the smell of transformation, the smell of work being done well. Erik's eyes, which had been fixed on the fire, began to grow heavy. The rhythm of the flames, the constant glow, the profound warmth, all of it seemed to wrap around him like a blanket. His breathing slowed. His awareness began to drift. But even as exhaustion pulled at him, part of his consciousness remained alert. Part of his awareness continued to observe the fire, ready to respond when the moment came to proceed with the next stage of the work. This was the state that long practice had taught him, the ability to rest without truly sleeping, to allow his body to recover even as his mind remained present and attentive. Hours passed in this state. Slowly, very gradually, the glow of the fire diminished as the ore continued its cooling process. The heat that had been almost unbearably intense was gradually moderating to a level that would allow removal and initial shaping. It was in this gradual transition, as the intensity of the fire was slowly decreasing and the transformed iron was slowly consolidating, that Erik found himself drifting into a state between waking and sleeping. The boundary between his individual consciousness and the larger consciousness of the work, the interplay of ore and fire and air and time, seemed to dissolve. He thought of his grandfather who had performed this same work in this same forge, guided by the same knowledge, experiencing the same transformations. He thought of his father, who had learned from his grandfather and taught Erik in turn. He thought of his son, who would eventually learn this work from him, who would stand in this forge and experience the same profound states that generations of craftsmen had experienced. The work continued, as it always continued. The transformation moved forward, as it always moved forward. The iron was becoming, as iron had always become, as it would continue to become as long as there were people who knew how to guide the process. And in this moment, sitting in a forge built into a Norwegian hillside, with fire glowing before him and the weight of centuries of craft tradition surrounding him, Erik felt a peace that went beyond words, beyond the individual self, beyond time itself. The night deepened into that particular stillness that came in the hours before dawn. Erik remained on his bench, his awareness hovering in that liminal space between complete wakefulness and sleep. The fire before him had become a living thing, breathing with its own rhythm, glowing with its own intelligence, requiring only the most minimal attention to maintain. His hands remained warm against his legs, his breathing synchronized with the subtle movements of the flames. Time had become something fluid, no longer marked by moments or hours, but simply by the gradual progression of the work itself. A memory surfaced unbidden, not a memory that demanded attention, but one that simply drifted through his consciousness like smoke. He was younger, perhaps 20 years old, standing in this same forge with his father. The elder Erik had been demonstrating the proper way to judge when ore was ready for removal, teaching his son through observation and example how the subtle changes in color and intensity indicated readiness. His father had said something that had stayed with him through all the years. The ore knows what it needs to become. Your job is not to force it, but to provide the conditions and listen carefully to what it is telling you. At the time, Erik had not fully understood. He had thought the words were simply poetic, the kind of thing that experienced craftsmen said. But over decades of standing before fires, of watching transformations unfold, of learning to read the subtle language of heat and glow and material response, the meaning had gradually revealed itself. The work was not about forcing one's will onto materials. It was about understanding the materials so deeply that one could anticipate their needs and provide exactly what they required at each stage. The transformed iron in the depths of the hearth was now ready. Erik knew this without needing to examine it, just as he knew when to breathe, when to blink. The knowledge existed at a level below conscious awareness. He rose from his bench with movements that were unhurried despite the deep tiredness in his body. The exhaustion was profound, the kind that came only from hours of sustained, focused work. But it was the good tiredness, the kind that came from meaningful labor well done. Using the long tongs that had been designed and shaped specifically for this purpose, Erik reached into the depths of the hearth and grasped the mass of transformed iron. The moment of removal was critical. The iron was still extremely hot, still glowing with a dull cherry red color, but it had solidified enough that it could be lifted without the mass falling apart. He drew the iron from the hearth with careful, steady motion. As it emerged into the cooler air of the forge, the transformation became visible. What had been scattered or particles, invisible in the layered materials, was now a cohesive mass. The bog iron had completed its journey from raw material to workable metal. The mass was larger this time than the previous smelting. The additional ore had yielded more iron. It glowed before him, a small beacon of transformation, still radiating heat but cooling gradually as it was exposed to the air. Erik set it on the prepared stone surface, positioning it carefully. The placement mattered. The iron needed to cool at a particular rate to develop the right internal structure. Too quickly, and it could become brittle. Too slowly, and it could develop internal weaknesses. But Erik's hands knew the correct positioning through decades of repetition. He stood back and simply observed the cooling iron. The glow gradually shifted from cherry red toward deeper tones of red-brown. The surface began to develop patterns, the natural texture of cooling metal that told the story of the transformation that had taken place. This was always a moment worth witnessing, a moment that never lost its particular beauty no matter how many times it was repeated. The proof that the process had worked. The evidence that knowledge and skill and years of practice had successfully guided materials through their transformation. The forge itself had cooled somewhat during the removal process. The initial intensity had diminished now that the major fire had burned down. Erik began the work of cleaning the hearth, removing spent charcoal, sweeping out ash, preparing the space for future work. The cleaning was methodical and meditative. Each piece of charcoal that had not fully burned could be saved for reuse. The ash would be carefully gathered. Some of it would be used in various applications throughout the settlement, and some would eventually be spread on the fields to enrich the soil. Nothing was wasted. As he worked, the eastern sky beyond the forge entrance began to show the first hints of approaching dawn. The darkness was becoming slightly less complete, shifting from absolute black toward deep blue-gray. The stars were beginning to fade as the approaching light of the sun prepared to reclaim the sky. By the time the cleaning was complete and all materials had been organized and stored, the first pale light of dawn was clearly visible beyond the entrance. The night's work was finished. The transformation was complete. The new day was beginning. Erik stood once more in the center of his workspace, surveying everything. The hearth was cleaned and ready. The cooling iron rested on its stone, gradually darkening as it continued its transition to solid state. The tools were organized. The materials were stored. The forge was in perfect order. The exhaustion that had been held at bay through hours of focus now began to make itself known. His body ached pleasantly, the ache of muscles that had worked steadily and meaningfully. His mind was beginning to drift toward the sleep that it desperately wanted. But there was one more task before rest would be possible. He needed to return home, needed to be present with Margaret as she began her day, needed to eat and recover before the afternoon's work. The shaping and refinement of the iron he had just created could begin. The walk home in the pale dawn light was surreal and dreamlike. The settlement was still mostly quiet, though here and there figures were beginning to move as the day commenced. The snow had a particular quality in the early light, almost luminescent, glowing with its own pale light. His home appeared ahead, and through the entrance, he could see the flicker of the fire that Margaret had kept burning through the night. The warmth that awaited inside was profound, both the literal warmth of the hearth and the deeper warmth of coming home, of returning to the place where he was known and understood and welcomed. Margaret was awake, as she always was when he returned from night work. She had learned long ago that sleep would not come during the hours when her husband was in the forge. She had spent the night occupied with quiet tasks, spinning, mending, the kinds of work that did not require the daylight to be completed. Was the smelting successful? She asked, though she could read the answer in the way he moved, in the particular quality of his exhaustion. It was, Erik confirmed. "The iron is good. There is perhaps enough for the pallet breaker with some remaining for other work." Margaret nodded and moved to the hearth. She had prepared a simple meal, bread softened with warm milk and honey, the kind of food that was easy to eat and would provide quick nourishment. She set it before her husband without comment, understanding that what he needed now was rest and sustenance, not conversation. Erik ate slowly, each bite seeming to require his full concentration. The exhaustion was becoming overwhelming now that the work was complete. His eyelids felt heavy. His thoughts were beginning to drift. When the meal was finished, he moved to the sleeping platform and settled onto it without undressing. Margaret covered him with blankets, and within moments, his breathing had slowed and deepened into the profound sleep of complete exhaustion. He slept through the entire morning and into the early afternoon. The sleep was deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep that the body demanded after hours of sustained physical labor. When he finally began to wake, the light in the dwelling had shifted, indicating that much of the day had already passed. Margaret was still occupied with her tasks, the spindle in her hands, the transformation of fleece into thread continuing in its patient, repetitive rhythm. She looked up as Erik stirred, but did not disturb him as he slowly transitioned from sleep to wakefulness. The return to consciousness was gradual and complete. His body felt restored. The deep exhaustion had been replaced by a pleasant sense of being rested. He rose from the sleeping platform and moved to the hearth, where water had been heating for washing. The cold water against his skin was shocking and refreshing. It washed away the residue of the night's work, the charcoal dust, the smell of smoke, the accumulated tiredness. By the time he had finished washing and dressing in fresh clothing, he felt more fully himself. "You have slept well," Margaret observed, setting aside her spinning. "The afternoon is still young. There is time for more work if you wish." "There is," Erik confirmed. "The iron will be cool enough now to begin the initial shaping, but there is no urgency. The work will be there when I am ready for it." They sat together for a time, eating a simple meal, cheese and bread, the kind of sustenance that could be prepared quickly and required no special preparation. Outside, the day was continuing in its quiet progression. The sun, though its light remained pale and distant, was providing enough illumination that the details of the settlement were visible. After the meal, Erik prepared to return to the forge. The afternoon's work would be the shaping of the newly smelted iron, the transformation from raw, cooled mass into the beginning stages of the pallet breaker tool that Soren had commissioned. The walk back to the forge took him once more through the settlement. The day was cold but clear, the snow pristine beneath the pale sunlight. His body felt strong and ready for the work ahead. The exhaustion of the night's labor had been replaced by the restedness of good sleep and proper nourishment. The forge welcomed him as it always did. The cooled iron rested where he had left it, now completely solid and dark, its transformation complete. The hearth was ready for the afternoon's work. The tools were organized and waiting. Erik positioned the iron on his anvil and selected his primary hammer. For a moment, he simply held it there, feeling the balance, the weight, the rightness of the position. Then he began the work of shaping, the first hammer blow striking true and clear, the sound ringing out across the forge and into the settlement beyond. The afternoon's work had begun. The rhythm was established. The transformation that would turn raw iron into a useful tool was now underway. And in the continuing cycle of days and work and transformation, the craft moved forward, generation after generation, continuing as it had continued for centuries before, and would continue for centuries hence. The afternoon light slanted through the forge entrance at a particular angle that meant the day was progressing into its later hours. Erik worked with steady focus, the hammer moving in its measured rhythm. Strike, examine, reposition, strike again. The iron was responding well to the shaping, gradually taking form under the careful guidance of his skill and knowledge. The pallet breaker tool that was emerging from the raw iron was complex in its own way. It was not a simple blade like the axe head had been, but rather a tool with multiple elements: a heavy striking surface, a curved wedge designed to slip under resistant materials, a handle connection that would need to be precisely balanced to allow effective use. Each element required different approaches. The striking surface needed to be heavy and dense, designed to deliver force effectively. The wedge needed to be shaped with precise angles so it would slip beneath timbers without binding. The handle connection needed to be shaped so that the tool's weight would be distributed properly when held and used. Erik moved through each phase of the shaping with the kind of deliberate attention that came from decades of practice. He did not rush, but neither did he hesitate. His hands and eyes and the accumulated knowledge of his years guided each decision about where to strike, how hard, when to reheat the iron to maintain its workability. As the afternoon deepened, the work progressed through several of the shaping stages. The iron was reheated periodically when it began to cool and harden beyond the point where the hammer could effectively shape it. Each reheating followed the same pattern, positioning the iron in the fire, rebuilding the flames, waiting for the metal to reach the correct temperature, then returning to the hammer work. Between these phases of intense work, Erik allowed himself brief moments of rest. He would sit on his bench and simply observe the forge, watching the way the light moved through the space, noticing the subtle shifts in the quality of the air as temperatures changed. These moments of rest were as essential as the work itself. They allowed his body to recover while his mind remained engaged with the task. The evening was approaching now, and the light from outside was beginning to take on the blue-gray tones that preceded nightfall. Inside the forge, the firelight was becoming the primary source of illumination. The shadows cast by the dancing flames created their own landscape, constantly shifting, hypnotic in their gentle motion. A visitor appeared in the entrance as the afternoon was transitioning toward evening. It was Magnus, an older man who had been involved with the settlement's trade routes for many years. He was weathered and worn by decades of travel, and he carried himself with the particular authority that came from having seen many places and many peoples. "I have brought news from the trading post to the south," Magnus called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the forge work. "There is a merchant from the coast who has taken an interest in acquiring tools. He is asking about iron implements, axes, scrapers, tools of various kinds. Erik paused mid-swing and turned toward the visitor. Trade opportunities like this were important to the settlement's economy, and they often resulted in significant commissions for the forge work. "What kinds of tools does this merchant seek?" Erik asked, setting down his hammer. "He mentioned axes primarily," Magnus replied, stepping fully into the forge. "But also scrapers for working leather, fire pokers, various implements. He seems to be gathering materials for trade further along the coastal routes. There is good money in it if the quality meets his standards." Erik nodded thoughtfully. The work he produced was already known to be of high quality, and such reputation opened doors. "Tell him I can provide tools, but the work requires time. If he is in a hurry, I cannot guarantee the quality he seeks. Quality cannot be rushed." "He understands this," Magnus assured him. "He will be in the area for several more weeks. There is time." After Magnus departed, Erik returned to his hammer work, but his mind had expanded slightly to encompass this new possibility. The commission he had already received from Soren would keep him occupied for some time, but after that was complete, the work for the coastal merchant could provide additional employment and purpose. This was how the craft sustained itself, through reputation, through the gradual accumulation of recognition that the work was worth the effort and expense, through connections that allowed the tools created in the forge to eventually reach people far beyond the settlement who had never met the craftsman, but trusted in the quality based on the word of those who had used the tools. The evening deepened, and Erik gradually wound down the day's shaping work. The pallet breaker tool was progressing well. It was perhaps halfway to completion. Another day, or possibly two, of careful shaping would be required before the major work was complete, and then the finishing phases would follow. He cleaned the hearth, banked the coals, and organized the tools. The familiar rituals of completion. The forge settled into its evening quiet, still warm but no longer actively burning with intense heat. The walk home took him through the settlement's evening activities. Smoke rose from hearths. The smell of various meals being prepared drifted through the cold air. People moved about their evening tasks, gathering wood, tending to animals, preparing for the night. His home appeared ahead, welcoming as always. Margaret had the evening meal already prepared, a rich pottage that had been simmering throughout the day, filling the small space with its comforting aroma. "The day's work progressed well?" she asked as he settled near the hearth. "It did," Erik confirmed. "The shaping of the tool is moving forward, and there is news of a possible larger commission, a merchant seeking to acquire multiple implements for trade. But that lies in the future. For now, the work continues as it has been." They ate together, and as they did, Erik found himself thinking about the conversation with Magnus. Trade opportunities meant recognition, meant that the work he was doing had value beyond the settlement itself, meant that the tools he created would eventually travel to places he would never see and be used by people he would never meet. This was one of the profound satisfactions of the craft, the understanding that the work extended far beyond the immediate moment, that it contributed to something larger than oneself. The tool that Soren would eventually use in his building work would serve its purpose for years. The tools that the coastal merchant sought would travel to other settlements, other regions, other people. The knowledge that Erik had been taught and that he was gradually passing on to a new generation would continue forward, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of centuries. After the meal, as evening deepened into night, Erik and Margaret settled into their familiar evening routines. Margaret returned to her spinning, the rhythm of the work creating its own kind of meditation. Erik performed maintenance on some of his tools, keeping them in perfect condition through careful attention. The fire on the home's hearth crackled softly, providing warmth and light. The sounds of the settlement gradually diminished as people retreated into their dwellings for the night. The wind outside carried the particular quality of winter, cold and clear, lacking the moisture that would bring additional snow. As the night deepened, Erik found his thoughts drifting toward his son once more. The boy was 8 years old now, growing stronger each season, developing the kind of patience and attention that would eventually allow him to learn the forge work. In another year or two, the teaching could begin in earnest. The thought brought a quiet satisfaction. The work would continue. The knowledge would be passed on. The generations would be connected through the shared understanding of fire and iron and transformation. What Erik had learned from his father, who had learned from his grandfather, would eventually flow into the next generation. The chain of craft knowledge would not be broken. By the time sleep claimed him, Erik had settled into a state of deep contentment. The days were following their patterns. The work was progressing well. The seasons were turning as they always turned. And in this settlement, in this forge built into a Norwegian hillside, the ancient craft of iron working continued its patient, eternal work. The next morning arrived with the same quiet clarity that had preceded the previous dawn. Erik woke rested and ready, and after the simple breakfast that Margaret prepared, he made his way once more to the forge. The day's work would continue the shaping of the pallet breaker tool, but as he settled into the familiar routines, checking the hearth, positioning the partially shaped iron, rebuilding the fire, Erik found himself reflecting on the larger arc of his life. He was in the middle years now. Behind him lay decades of learning and practice. Ahead of him, if the gods granted him health and life, lay more decades of continuing work. But the work that would extend beyond his own lifetime was the teaching, the gradual transmission of knowledge to a new generation that would eventually replace him. This was the deepest meaning of craft, not the individual tools created, valuable as they were, but the continuation of knowledge and skill across the generations. Every experienced craftsman eventually became a teacher, passing on what had been learned, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom would not be lost. As he worked through the morning, Erik found himself anticipating the coming seasons. Spring would arrive eventually, and with it, the time when his son could begin the initial lessons of the forge work. The boy would learn slowly, through observation and simple tasks. He would begin to understand the nature of fire and iron. He would slowly develop the patience and attention that the craft demanded. It would take years, many years, for the boy to become truly skilled. But eventually, if all went well, he would grow into a craftsman himself, capable of creating tools, of performing smelting work, of shaping iron with the same kind of quiet skill that his father possessed. And perhaps, many years in the future, that boy would stand in this same forge and teach his own son, passing on knowledge that stretched back through centuries of craftsmen before him and forward into centuries of craftsmen yet to come. The thought was deeply satisfying. It placed the individual moment, this particular day, this particular tool being shaped, into a larger context of continuity and meaning that transcended any single person or any single lifetime. The work continued. The hammer rose and fell. The iron was gradually transformed from raw metal into the useful tool it was destined to become. And in the quiet dedication of one man's hands and knowledge and skill, the ancient craft moved forward, generation after generation, unchanged and eternal. As the winter days continue their slow progression towards spring, and as the pallet breaker tool approaches completion, the rhythm of life in the settlement continues its patient unfolding. Erik moves through his days in the forge, guided by knowledge passed down through generations, contributing his own skills and dedication to the continuation of craft that has sustained communities like this for centuries. The work is never finished. There is always more ore to smelt, more iron to shape, more tools to create. But in this endless cycle of transformation and creation, there is profound meaning, the understanding that the tools created will outlast the maker, that the knowledge passed on will survive beyond any individual lifetime, that the craft itself is immortal even as the craftsmen who practice it are mortal. This is the deepest satisfaction of meaningful work, not the recognition or the payment, though these have their place, but the understanding that one is part of something larger than oneself, something that connects the past to the present to the future in an unbroken chain of human skill and dedication. The days following the initial shaping of the pallet breaker tool settled into their own particular rhythm. The work progressed steadily, each day bringing the tool closer to completion. The hammer strikes continued their measured pattern. The iron responded to each careful blow, and the form of the tool gradually clarified and refined. By the third day of work, the major shaping was complete. The pallet breaker now had its essential form, the heavy striking surface, the curved wedge designed to slip beneath timbers, the connection point where a handle would eventually be attached. What remained was the finishing work, the refinement of surfaces, the sharpening of edges, the careful adjustment of angles to ensure perfect functionality. Erik worked through these final phases with the same meticulous attention he brought to every stage of the craft. The differences were subtle but crucial. A slightly different angle to the wedge would make the tool more effective. A smoother surface on the striking head would allow better force transfer. Each small refinement contributed to the overall quality of the finished tool. It was during this finishing work that a thought emerged in Erik's mind, a thought that had been gathering for some time but only now came into clear focus. His son was growing, and the time for formal training was approaching. But before beginning that formal teaching, it would be valuable for the boy to understand the basics through simpler exposure. On the afternoon of the fourth day of work on the pallet breaker, as the tool was approaching its final completion, Erik decided to send a message home. He asked a young person from the settlement who was passing by the forge if they would carry word to his wife that his son should come to the forge the following morning. "Tell Margaret that I wish to show the boy the work," Erik said simply. "Tell her to send him when the morning meal is complete." That evening, as Erik returned home and settled into his usual place near the hearth, he mentioned the plan to Margaret. "It is time," he said simply. "Not for intensive teaching yet. He is still young. But time to begin understanding what the work truly is, beyond simply seeing smoke rise from the forge." Margaret nodded, understanding the significance of this moment. "He will be both excited and afraid," she said. "The forge is a powerful place for a child. The heat, the noise, the transformation of materials." "The fear will pass," Erik replied, "and the excitement will grow into understanding if I guide it properly." The next morning arrived clear and cold. After the breakfast meal was complete, Erik's son, a boy named Thomas, named after Erik's maternal grandfather, appeared at the forge entrance. The boy was 8 years old, tall for his age but still carrying the particular lankiness of childhood. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's more open expression, a combination that gave him an appearance of curiosity and gentle questioning. "Father said I should come," Thomas announced, his voice carrying the slight uncertainty of a child entering an unfamiliar space. "Come," Erik beckoned, gesturing his son forward. "There is work to do, and I thought you might observe how it is done." The boy stepped into the forge and immediately stopped, his eyes widening at the sight before him. The space was warm, much warmer than the exterior cold. The smell was unfamiliar, a combination of charcoal and metal and heat that existed nowhere else in the settlement. The flickering light from the fire created dancing shadows across the stone walls. "It is large," Thomas said, observing the space with the kind of careful attention that children sometimes brought to new environments. "The work requires space," Erik confirmed. "Come, and I will show you what I am doing." He led his son to the hearth, where the fire was burning at a moderate level. The pallet breaker tool rested on the anvil, awaiting the final phase of work. "This is iron," Erik said, pointing to the tool. "Raw iron, taken from the bog and transformed by fire and air into this form. Do you understand what that means? That what began as scattered material in the marshes has become this solid thing." Thomas stared at the tool, his young mind working through the concept. "It was different before?" he asked. "Yes," Erik confirmed. "It was scattered, formless. The work transformed it. Do you see the shape of it?" "It looks hard," Thomas observed. "It is very hard," Erik agreed, "and heavy. The hardness and weight are what make it useful for the work it will do. But before it was hard and heavy, it was soft and shapeable. That is when the hammer work was done, when the iron was warm and responsive." Erik picked up the tool and placed it in his son's hands. Thomas nearly dropped it. The weight was surprising, but he managed to hold it, his small hands struggling slightly with the mass. "Feel the weight," Erik instructed. "This is what will make the tool effective. When a person uses this to do their work, they will feel this weight, and it will help them accomplish their task. They spent time simply examining the tool, feeling its surface, understanding its shape, beginning to grasp the relationship between form and function. Erik did not overwhelm his son with explanation. He simply answered the questions that arose, allowing the boy to develop his own understanding through observation and tactile experience. Then, with careful supervision, Erik showed his son the process of the fire. He explained how charcoal was arranged, how air was necessary for the flames to exist, how the heat served a purpose. He did not attempt to teach the complex understanding yet. That would come with years of practice and observation. But he began to plant the seeds of understanding. "The fire transforms things," Erik said, pointing to the flames. "Look at how the charcoal changes. It begins as one thing and becomes another. This is the work of heat and air together." Thomas watched the flames with fascination. "Could anything be transformed?" he asked. "Some things," Erik replied, "but not everything. Iron, yes. Charcoal, yes. But stone resists. Water would turn to steam in the intense heat, but it would not transform to something else. Different materials respond differently to the work of fire and transformation." The morning passed in this exploratory way. Erik was introducing his son to the forge, not as a place of instruction, but as a place of discovery. The boy was learning through observation and questioning, developing a feel for the space and the work, beginning to understand in the intuitive way that children learn before they can fully articulate what they know. By mid-morning, Thomas was beginning to tire. The heat of the forge was intense, and the stimulation of the new environment was wearing on his energy. Erik recognized the signs and sent his son home. "Go," he said gently. "Tell your mother that you have seen enough for today. Return tomorrow if you wish to observe more. The work continues every day. There will be time to learn it gradually." Thomas departed, carrying with him the impressions and sensations of the forge. The heat, the smell, the sound of the hammer, the sight of transformation, the weight of iron in his hands. These sensations would remain with him, would gradually integrate into his understanding of what his father did, and would form the foundation upon which more intensive teaching could eventually be built. Over the following days, Thomas returned to the forge several times, each visit brief and focused on simple observation. He watched his father work. He listened to explanations that were carefully calibrated to his level of understanding. He gradually became more comfortable in the space, more familiar with the rhythms of the work. On the day that Erik completed the pallet breaker tool, he called his son to the forge specifically to observe the finishing process. Thomas watched as his father performed the final refinements, the careful adjustment of edges, the polishing of surfaces, the final testing of the tool's balance and function. "This tool is now complete," Erik explained as he set the finished work aside. "It has taken several days to transform the raw iron into this finished form. Do you understand the process?" Thomas considered the question carefully, his young mind working through what he had observed. "You shape it with the hammer," he said, "and the fire helps it. Become soft so you can shape it." Very good, Erik confirmed. You understand the basics. The rest, the deeper understanding of how to do this work well, that will come over many years, but you have now seen the beginning. That evening, when Erik returned home, he found Søren waiting near his dwelling. The builder had come to collect the completed pallet breaker tool. "I have finished your tool," Erik said. "It is ready to be collected whenever you wish." Søren's face brightened with satisfaction. "Excellent. I will come to the forge tomorrow to examine it and arrange payment." The transaction took place the following day, as agreed. Søren examined the pallet breaker tool with the careful attention of a skilled craftsman examining the work of another skilled craftsman. He tested the weight, examined the angles of the wedge, and assessed the quality of the finish. "This is excellent work," Søren finally pronounced. "The tool is precisely as I envisioned it. It will serve me well for many years, I am certain." The payment was discussed and agreed upon, a fair exchange that reflected the quality of the work and the materials used. Such transactions were the foundation of the settlement's economy. Skilled work exchanged for goods or other services that would support the craftsman's continued survival and the ability to practice the craft. With the pallet breaker completed and paid for, Erik's attention turned to the next project. The coastal merchant that Magnus had mentioned weeks earlier was still in the area, and word had spread that he was interested in acquiring high-quality iron tools. Erik began preparations for creating a collection of tools, several axes of different sizes and weights, various smaller implements, tools designed for specific purposes. The work would occupy him for weeks, perhaps months, and the commission would provide significant resources for the settlement. But before beginning this intensive work, he allowed himself a period of rest. The days of sustained labor had accumulated, and the body required recovery. He spent time at home, working on small maintenance projects, spending time with his family, allowing the accumulated fatigue to gradually dissipate. His son continued to visit the forge occasionally, always under the same pattern: brief visits, simple observation, no formal instruction. But the seeds of understanding were being planted. Thomas was beginning to grasp, in the intuitive way that children learn, what the forge work truly entailed. The fear that had initially marked his first visit was gradually being replaced by understanding and a growing sense of comfort in the space. One afternoon, as Thomas was observing his father prepare materials for the next project, the boy asked a question that made Erik smile. "When I am grown," Thomas said, "will I make iron like you do?" Erik paused in his work and looked at his son. The question carried with it the weight of potential futures, the possibility of continuation, the transmission of knowledge across generations. "If you wish to learn," Erik replied carefully, "I will teach you, but it is your choice. The craft demands patience and dedication. It requires years of practice before you understand it truly. It is not easy work, but if you choose it, I will guide you." Thomas considered this seriously, his young face thoughtful. "I think I want to learn," he said finally. "The fire is interesting, and I want to understand how things are transformed." "Then we will begin your instruction properly when you are older," Erik said. "Perhaps in another year or two, when you are stronger and more able to understand the complexities. For now, continue to observe. Continue to ask questions. Allow your understanding to grow gradually." The boy nodded, satisfied with this answer, and returned to his observation of the forge work. That evening, as Erik shared the conversation with Margaret, she smiled with a quiet satisfaction. "He has the right temperament for it," she observed. "He asks careful questions. He observes patiently. He does not rush to conclusions. These are the qualities that make a good craftsman." "Perhaps," Erik agreed. "But time will tell. A child's interests can change. He may grow and decide that the forge work is not what he truly wishes to do. I will not force him toward it. But if he chooses it, the knowledge is there to be passed on." As the evening deepened and the family settled into sleep, Erik found himself reflecting on the longer arc of his life. He had received the craft from his father, who had received it from his father. The chain stretched back through generations, each craftsman learning from the one before, each adding their own particular skills and understanding to the collective knowledge. And now, with his son showing interest and beginning to understand the basics, that chain might continue forward into the future. The work would not end with him. The knowledge would not be lost. The transformation of bog iron into useful tools would continue, performed by hands trained by his hands, guided by understanding passed from mind to mind across the generations. This was the deepest immortality that a craftsman could achieve, not the memory of individual tools created, but the continuation of the knowledge itself, the unbroken chain of craft that connected past to present to future. The weeks following the completion of the pallet breaker tool settled into a new rhythm. Erik began the work of creating the collection of implements for the coastal merchant. This was a more expansive project than the individual commissions he typically received. Multiple tools of varying types and sizes, all requiring high quality, but allowing him to work with a certain efficiency born from repetition. The first item he created was a large axe, designed for the kind of heavy work required in forest clearing and timber processing. The bog iron smelting process was repeated, now with the understanding that a larger quantity would be needed. The transformation of raw ore into workable metal proceeded as it always did, heat and air and time, and the accumulation of knowledge guiding the process forward. His son continued to visit the forge, though not every day. The visits followed the same pattern established in the early weeks: observation, brief explanation, answering questions that arose naturally from what the boy was witnessing. Thomas was gradually becoming more comfortable in the intense environment, less overwhelmed by the heat and sound, more focused on understanding the actual processes being performed. One morning, as Erik was preparing to begin a new smelting project, Thomas arrived earlier than usual. The boy was carrying something, a piece of leather wrapped carefully around an object. "Mother said I should give you this," Thomas announced, unwrapping the leather to reveal a small piece of iron, not finished or refined, but simply a raw piece of the metal. Erik recognized it immediately. It was a piece left over from one of his own projects, a small scrap that he had set aside. Margaret had apparently given it to their son with the intention that the boy should have something tangible to understand. "Do you know what this is?" Erik asked, taking the piece from his son and examining it. "You said it was iron," Thomas replied, "that it came from the bog." "Yes," Erik confirmed. "And do you understand what this iron could become?" Thomas shook his head, his young face thoughtful. Erik held the small piece up to the light. This small scrap could be heated and shaped and reformed. It could become part of a larger tool, or it could be added to other iron and smelted again, becoming part of something entirely new. Nothing is truly lost in the forge work. Materials are transformed, reshaped, but the essential iron remains. He handed the piece back to his son. "Keep this," Erik said. "It is your first piece of iron. Someday, if you choose to learn the craft, we will take this very piece and transform it together. You will see how the fire makes it soft, how the hammer shapes it, how raw material becomes something useful." Thomas held the iron carefully, examining it with new understanding. The small piece, which had seemed like nothing more than a curiosity moments before, now carried weight and significance. It was a promise, a connection between the present moment and possible futures. The weeks continued their progression. Winter was beginning to release its grip on the land, though snow still covered everything and the cold remained intense. But there were subtle signs of approaching change. The quality of light shifting slightly, the angle of the sun beginning to shift northward, the days becoming imperceptibly longer. The work for the coastal merchant progressed steadily. Erik created several axes of different sizes, each one carefully shaped and refined. He created a collection of smaller tools, fire pokers, scrapers designed for various purposes, implements whose specific functions might not be immediately obvious but which had practical applications. Each tool was created with the same dedication to quality that he brought to all his work. The bog iron was smelted with care. The shaping was precise. The finishing was meticulous. The result was a collection of implements that represented the accumulated skill and knowledge of generations of craftsmen, embodied in the work of one man's hands. By the time the collection was complete, nearly 2 months had passed since the initial conversation with Magnus. The coastal merchant arrived at the forge on a day of unusual warmth for late winter, a day when the sun's power was enough to begin the processes of melting that would continue through the spring. The merchant was a man of middle years, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent much of his time traveling. He examined each tool carefully, testing weight and balance, assessing the quality of the work with an experienced eye. "This is excellent work," he said finally, after examining the last of the collection. "The quality is as high as anything I have seen from the southern settlements. These tools will serve well in trade. I am interested in acquiring more if you are willing to provide them." They discussed terms, the price for the current collection, and the possibility of future commissions. The merchant intended to travel regularly along the coastal trade routes, and he indicated that he would be willing to purchase tools on a regular basis if Erik could provide them. It was a significant opportunity. It meant steady work, consistent income, and the knowledge that the tools created in the forge were traveling far beyond the immediate settlement, reaching people in distant places, serving purposes in regions Erik would never visit. The transaction was completed, payment transferred, and the merchant arranged for transport of the tools. As he prepared to depart, he offered one final comment. "I will return in a few months," he said. "If you can have another collection ready, I will purchase it. The quality of your work opens doors to markets that are hungry for reliable, well-crafted implements." After the merchant departed, Erik stood in the center of his forge, experiencing a quiet satisfaction. The work had been recognized, valued, and compensated fairly. More importantly, it would continue. There would be ongoing commissions, ongoing opportunities to practice the craft at a level that was both challenging and sustainable. That evening, as he shared the news with Margaret, he found himself already contemplating the next phase of work. The commissions for the merchant would require sustained effort, but they were also predictable in a way that allowed for planning and organization. "This changes things," Margaret observed thoughtfully. "Regular work, ongoing income. It provides a kind of security we have not had before." "It does," Erik agreed. "And it means the craft is valued beyond the immediate settlement. The knowledge and skill that has been accumulated across generations is being recognized and sought after." As the weeks progressed into spring, the patterns of work shifted. The winter's most intense cold began to ease. The snow gradually diminished, revealing the earth beneath. Green began to appear on trees and vegetation as life returned to the landscape after the dormant months. Thomas's visits to the forge became more regular. The boy was growing visibly, becoming stronger and more capable. His understanding of the work, though still elementary, was deepening through consistent observation and the patient explanations that his father provided. On a mild afternoon, as the spring sun was creating a particular quality of light that came only at this time of year, Erik made a decision. "I think the time is approaching," he said to Margaret that evening, "to begin your son's more formal instruction. Not the intensive work yet, he is still young, but the basics, the foundational understanding, the skills that will eventually allow him to become truly skilled if he chooses." Margaret nodded. She had been observing her son's growing understanding and capability, and she agreed that the time was approaching. "When will you begin?" she asked. "After the spring festival," Erik replied. "When the weather has fully settled and the long, warm days have arrived. The forge work is demanding, and he will need to be strong enough to withstand the heat and the physical demands. But yes, the time is coming." That night, after Margaret had fallen asleep, Erik remained awake for a time, thinking about what the future would hold. His son would learn the craft. The knowledge would be transmitted across another generation. The chain would continue, unbroken and eternal. He thought about his own father, long dead now, but present still in every technique that Erik performed, every piece of knowledge he possessed. His grandfather, whom he had never known but whose understanding lived on in the methods and approaches that had been taught to Erik through his father. And he thought about his son, who might one day teach his own child, continuing the chain forward into the future. The individual craftsman might come and go, but the craft itself would persist. The knowledge, once gained and understood, could not be lost. In the darkness of the sleeping dwelling, with the fire on the hearth providing gentle warmth and the sounds of the settlement quiet around him, Erik felt a deep peace settle over him. The work was good. It was meaningful. It would continue beyond his own lifetime. And in that continuation lay a kind of immortality that transcended the individual self. The spring advanced, and with it came the beginning of the new season of work. The coastal merchant would return with the warm months, eager to purchase more tools for trade. The settlement's own needs for iron implements would continue. And now, there would be the additional work of teaching, transmitting to a new generation the knowledge and skill that had been entrusted to Erik by those who came before. The forge would continue. The iron would continue to be worked and transformed. And the ancient knowledge of the craft would flow forward, generation after generation, carrying within it the accumulated wisdom of all the craftsmen who had practiced it before, and all those who would practice it in the centuries yet to come. As the winter releases its final grip and spring settles more fully over the Norwegian landscape, the rhythms of Erik's life continue their patient, eternal progression. The work of the forge moves forward. The transmission of knowledge to the next generation begins. The chain of craft stretches backward through generations and forward into futures that Erik will never see. In this quiet dedication to meaningful work, in the patient accumulation of skill and knowledge, in the transmission of understanding across generations, there is a profound peace. The knowledge that one's efforts contribute to something larger than the individual self, that the work will continue beyond one's own lifetime, that one is part of an unbroken chain of human skill and dedication that stretches back through centuries and forward into ages, yet unwritten. This is the deepest satisfaction of craft, not the recognition or reward, though these have their place, but the understanding that the work matters, that it will endure, that it connects past to present to future in an eternal cycle of transformation and creation. The spring season advanced with steady progression towards summer. The landscape transformed gradually from the white stillness of winter into the green vitality of warmer months. The settlement, which had moved slowly through the cold season, began to accelerate its rhythms as the longer days provided more hours for work. Erik stood at the entrance of his forge one morning in late spring, observing the changes. The snow had completely melted weeks ago. The paths through the settlement were now dry, marked by the wear of increasing foot traffic. The air, while still cool in the early morning, carried the promise of warmth by midday. This morning marked the formal beginning of Thomas's instruction in the forge craft. The boy was 9 years old now, having grown noticeably through the winter months. He was stronger than he had been, more capable of sustained physical effort, more ready to understand the complexities of the work. Thomas arrived at the forge entrance, dressed in simple clothing that Margaret had prepared specifically for the work, sturdy wool and linen that could withstand heat and physical exertion. His face carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Today we begin the real work," Erik said, greeting his son. Not observation as before. Today you will learn by doing. I am ready, Thomas replied, though his voice held a slight tremor of uncertainty. Good, Erik confirmed. We will begin with the simplest tasks, the preparation of materials, the gathering and organizing of charcoal and ore. These tasks are essential to the work, though they do not require the full skill of shaping metal. But they must be done carefully, with attention and precision. Everything that follows depends on these foundations. For the first weeks of the formal instruction, Thomas was kept occupied with these preparatory tasks. He learned to select charcoal pieces of the proper size and density. He learned to gather bog ore from the marshes, to examine it carefully for quality, to accumulate and organize it for use. He learned to maintain the tools, to keep them clean and organized, to understand the purpose of each implement. The work was not glamorous or immediately satisfying, but Erik understood its importance. A craftsman who could not properly prepare materials would never create quality work, no matter how skilled he became at the actual shaping. The foundations had to be solid. Thomas worked steadily through these tasks, his young body gradually becoming accustomed to the physical demands of labor. His hands developed calluses. His understanding of materials deepened. He began to comprehend, through direct experience rather than explanation, why particular approaches to preparation were necessary. By the beginning of summer, when the days had become genuinely warm and the sun remained visible in the sky for long hours, Thomas was ready for the next phase of instruction. Erik began to teach the basics of fire management. Fire is the heart of the work, Erik explained one afternoon as they stood before the forge hearth. Everything depends on understanding how to create fire, how to maintain it, how to control it. Watch carefully. He demonstrated the process of creating spark from flint and steel, of nursing the spark into flame with tinder, of adding kindling gradually to build the fire to the necessary intensity. Thomas watched with intense concentration, his entire being focused on understanding the process. "Your turn," Erik said, handing his son the fire-starting materials. Thomas's first attempts were clumsy. The spark would catch in the tinder, but his breath would be too forceful or too gentle, and the flame would either extinguish or burn too intensely. But gradually, through repetition and correction, his understanding deepened. His hands learned the proper force, the proper timing, the proper technique. By the time summer was well established, Thomas could create fire reliably. He could build it from nothing to usable flame with patience and proper technique. He understood the relationship between air, fuel, and heat. He had developed the fundamental skill upon which all other forge work depended. "You are ready now," Erik said one afternoon, observing his son's reliable fire-creating ability, to begin learning the basics of metal shaping. "But before we do that, I want you to understand something important." They sat together on the familiar bench, and Erik placed a piece of raw iron in his son's hands. "This iron," Erik said, "is not just material. It is the result of transformation of bog ore that has been gathered from marshes, heated and shaped by human knowledge and skill. When you hold this iron, you are holding the result of generations of knowledge. Your grandfather shaped iron. My father shaped iron. I shape iron. And if you choose this path, you will shape iron." Thomas held the piece carefully, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility and tradition that accompanied the craft. "The work is not easy," Erik continued. "It demands patience, precision, and dedication. It requires standing before intense heat, performing physical labor, maintaining focus through long hours. But when the work is done well, when iron is transformed into a tool that will serve people for years or decades, there is a satisfaction that transcends the difficulty." "I understand," Thomas said quietly, his young face serious with the weight of what was being conveyed to him. "Good," Erik replied. "Then we will begin the shaping work. We will start with simple practice pieces, scraps of iron that do not need to become anything specific. You will learn to strike the hammer properly, to understand how the metal responds, to develop the coordination and intuition that true skill requires." The next phase of instruction began the following day. Erik had set aside pieces of scrap iron, materials that could be struck and reshaped without concern for the final product. These would serve as Thomas's practice materials. "The hammer is an extension of your arm," Erik explained, positioning his son's hands on the hammer handle. "You do not simply strike it against the metal. You guide it, you control the force, you place each blow with intention. Watch my hands carefully." He demonstrated the proper grip, the proper stance, the proper motion. The hammer rose and fell, striking the iron with a clear, ringing tone. The metal under the hammer's strikes shifted and changed form, responding to the carefully controlled force. "Now you try," Erik said. Thomas's first attempts were hesitant and uncoordinated. The hammer felt heavy and unwieldy in his young hands. The strikes were sometimes too forceful, sometimes too gentle. But as with the fire starting, patience and repetition gradually bore fruit. Through the summer days, as the sun remained visible for long hours, and the heat of the season combined with the forge's inherent warmth, Thomas learned the fundamentals of hammer work. His strikes became more controlled. His understanding of how metal responded to force deepened. His young hands gradually developed the strength necessary for the work. One afternoon in midsummer, as the sun was at its highest, and the heat in the forge was almost unbearable, Erik paused the day's work. "You are learning well," he said to his son, who was breathing heavily from exertion. "Your understanding is developing, but I want you to know that this is only the beginning. True mastery of this craft requires years, many years. What you are learning now are the basics, the foundation. The deepening of understanding will come through years of practice and dedication." "How long?" Thomas asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. 10 years, perhaps," Erik replied. "Perhaps more. By the time you are a grown man, you could be truly skilled, but only if you continue the work with dedication and attention. There is no shortcut to mastery." Thomas nodded, understanding that what he was beginning was not a sprint, but a journey that would define much of his life. That evening, as Erik and his son walked home together through the warm summer dusk, they passed several of the settlement's craftspeople. The weaver was outside, taking advantage of the light to organize threads. The leather worker was processing hides. Each person was engaged in their own particular craft, their own particular dedication to skill and knowledge. "Everyone has work," Thomas observed. "Yes," Erik confirmed. "The settlement survives because each person practices their craft with dedication. The weaver creates cloth. The leather worker creates materials. The farmer grows food. The builder creates structures. And I create tools from iron. Together, these crafts sustain the community." "And I will create tools from iron too?" Thomas asked. "If you wish," Erik replied. "The choice will remain yours, but if you choose this path, I will guide you. And someday, perhaps your own child will learn from you, and the knowledge will continue forward." They walked in comfortable silence for a time, and Thomas found himself thinking about this possibility of standing in the forge many years in the future, teaching someone else what he was now learning. The thought was both daunting and somehow deeply satisfying. By the time true summer had settled over the land, Thomas had become a regular fixture at the forge. His presence was no longer novel or exceptional, but simply part of the daily rhythm of work. He prepared materials, maintained the fire, practiced his hammer work, and gradually accumulated the foundational understanding that would eventually allow him to create actual tools rather than practice pieces. The coastal merchant returned in early summer, as promised, eager to commission another collection of tools. Erik accepted the commission with the understanding that the work would need to be balanced with his son's continuing instruction. "The boy needs to learn," Erik explained to the merchant. "He will be helping with the preparation of materials and other tasks. The quality of the finished work will not be affected, but the pace may be somewhat slower than in previous commissions." The merchant agreed without hesitation. He had already found the quality of Erik's work to be reliable and worth the investment, and he was willing to work at whatever pace was necessary. Through the summer and into early autumn, Erik worked on the commissioned collection while simultaneously continuing Thomas's formal instruction. The boy gradually took on more responsibility, preparing materials with greater skill and efficiency, assisting with the heating and positioning of metals, and beginning to understand the full scope of the transformation process. One afternoon in late summer, as they were in the midst of shaping a larger axe head, Erik made a decision. "I think you are ready," he said to his son, "to attempt your first complete tool. Not a practice piece, but an actual implementation meant to serve a purpose and be used by someone in the settlement." Thomas's eyes widened. "What kind of tool?" he asked. "A fire poker," Erik replied. "It is simpler than an axe or other larger implements, but it requires proper shaping and finishing. It will demand attention and care. If you can complete this tool well, you will have created something of real value." The next day, Thomas began his first true project. Erik had prepared a piece of bog iron specifically for this purpose. Enough material to create a functional fire poker, but not so much that the work would be overwhelmingly complex. The process began with heating the iron to the proper working temperature. Thomas, under his father's careful guidance, positioned the metal in the fire, managed the bellows to achieve the necessary heat, and waited with increasing anticipation for the moment when the shaping could begin. When the iron had reached the correct temperature, glowing with the proper cherry red color, Erik stepped back. "This is your work now," he said to his son. "I will observe and correct if necessary, but the hammer work is yours to do. Create the tool." With his father watching carefully, Thomas picked up the hammer and approached the anvil. His young hands gripped the hammer handle. He positioned himself as he had been taught, and then he struck, not tentatively, but with the growing confidence of someone who had practiced this motion countless times. The hammer struck true. The metal began to form. Strike after strike, with pauses to observe and reposition, Thomas gradually shaped the raw iron into the beginnings of a fire poker. The work was not perfect. There were awkward moments where the angle was not quite right, where the force needed adjustment. But through persistence and careful attention, the shape began to emerge. The long handle began to take form. The pointed end, which would eventually be used to manipulate coals and logs, gradually clarified. The first heating was only the beginning. The work would require multiple stages, multiple heatings, multiple phases of shaping, eventual finishing and refinement. But the foundation had been laid. Thomas had begun his first true project. By the time early autumn arrived and the air began to cool, Thomas's first fire poker was nearly complete. It would not be perfect. There would be rough areas that needed refinement, and the shape would be somewhat uneven compared to tools created by someone with decades of experience. But it would be functional. Someone in the settlement would use this tool that Thomas had created, and it would serve its purpose well. On the day that the fire poker was finally complete, Erik and his son stood together in the forge, examining the finished work. "This is your creation," Erik said to his son. "You gathered the ore, you prepared the materials, you shaped this metal with your own hands. This tool will outlast us both, likely. It will be used by people in the settlement for years. This is the true value of the craft, creating something that endures, something that serves people, something that will continue to exist and be useful long after the craftsman who created it is gone." Thomas held the fire poker carefully, feeling its weight, understanding for perhaps the first time the profound significance of what he had accomplished. He had not simply created an object. He had created something functional, something that would serve a real purpose, something that was the result of his own growing skill and knowledge. "I made this," Thomas said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "You did," Erik confirmed. "And you will make many more. Each one will teach you something. Each one will deepen your understanding. Each one will make you a better craftsman. This is how mastery is achieved, not through sudden insight, but through the gradual accumulation of knowledge, the persistent practice of the craft, the committed effort to create quality work." That evening, Thomas brought the fire poker home to show his mother. Margaret examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands, assessing the quality with the understanding that came from 19 years of watching her husband's work. "It is good," she said finally. "There is skill evident in this work. Your father has taught you well." The words filled Thomas with a profound sense of satisfaction that went beyond simple praise. He had created something real. He had been recognized as having done good work. He had taken the first true steps on a path that stretched back through generations and would, if he chose to continue, stretch forward into a future that he would eventually help to shape. As autumn settled over the land and the days began to grow shorter, the rhythms of work continued. The coastal merchant's commissioned collection was completed and transported. New work was beginning. Thomas continued his instruction, now with the confidence that came from having successfully completed a real project. The chain of craft continued forward, unbroken and eternal. Knowledge flowed from one generation to the next. The ancient work of transforming iron endured, carried forward by hands trained by other hands, guided by understanding passed from mind to mind across the generations. As autumn settled deeply over the settlement, the days grew shorter, and the temperature began its gradual descent toward winter. The leaves, which had been green through the summer and early autumn, transformed into shades of gold and red before drifting to the ground in the cool wind. Thomas walked home from the forge one afternoon, carrying with him the knowledge of a summer and autumn well spent. His hands, once soft and unmarked, now bore the marks of his work, small calluses, the faint scars of minor burns, the permanent staining that came from working with iron and charcoal. His body had grown stronger through the season of instruction. His mind had expanded to encompass new understanding. The fire poker he had created rested in the settlement's common hearth now, used by whoever needed to tend the fire. A simple tool doing simple work, unnoticed and unremarkable except for the fact that it had been created by a young man's hands, guided by his father's knowledge, bearing within it the weight of generations of craft tradition. Margaret was preparing the evening meal as Thomas arrived home. The autumn harvest had been gathered, and the settlement was in that particular state of preparation that came each year as winter approached. Root vegetables had been stored in cool cellars. Grain had been threshed and winnowed. Meat had been preserved through smoking and salting. The settlement was ready for the season of cold and scarcity that would come. "Your father sent word that he will be late," Margaret said as Thomas settled near the hearth. "There is work yet to complete before the weather becomes truly difficult." "I know," Thomas replied. He had spent enough time in the forge now to understand the rhythms of the work, to know when deadlines approached, to recognize when urgent effort was necessary to complete projects before weather made certain tasks impossible. They ate together, a simple meal of bread and preserved vegetables and cheese. The fire on the hearth crackled softly, its warmth pushing back against the increasing chill of evening. Later, as darkness settled completely outside and the wind carried the particular quality of approaching winter, Erik returned home. His face was flushed from the forge's heat, his movements tired but satisfied. He settled near the fire, accepting the warm drink that Margaret offered. "The work progresses," he said simply. "The collection for the merchant is nearly complete. 2 more axes and the commission will be fulfilled." "Thomas worked well at the forge today," Margaret said, glancing toward her son. "He is learning quickly." Erik nodded, acknowledging the truth of this observation. He looked at his son with an expression that carried both satisfaction and something deeper, an awareness that the transmission of knowledge was taking place, that the craft was being passed forward, that the chain would continue beyond his own lifetime. "You have done well," Erik said to his son. "The summer and autumn's work have been a good foundation. When spring returns, we will continue. There is much yet to learn, but you have begun the journey." Thomas felt the weight of his father's words, the significance of the statement. He had begun a journey that would define much of his life. He had taken his first true steps as a craftsman. The future stretched before him, years of learning, years of practice, eventually years of mastery, and the creation of tools that would serve people and communities. As the evening deepened and the family settled into the night, the wind outside grew stronger, carrying with it the first genuine breath of winter. The snow would come again. The cold would return. The settlement would slow its pace and focus on endurance through the difficult season. But the forge would continue to burn. The work would continue. And when spring returned, Thomas would return to the forge with his father, continuing the patient accumulation of knowledge and skill that was the true work of craft. In the warmth of the hearth, with his family around him and the satisfaction of work well begun settling over him, Thomas felt a peace that transcended the individual moment. He was part of something larger than himself, a chain of craftsmen stretching backward through generations and forward into futures he would never see. The knowledge lived in his hands now, transmitted through his father's patient instruction, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of all those who had practiced the craft before him. The fire crackled softly, providing warmth and gentle light. Outside, the wind moved through the settlement, stirring snow and moving through the spaces between dwellings. Inside this home, in this moment, there was peace and satisfaction, and the deep contentment that came from knowing one's place in the larger pattern of things. This was enough. This was more than enough. This was a life well lived, with work that mattered, with knowledge that would endure, with a future that would be shaped by the choices being made in the present. The night deepened, and the settlement slept, preparing itself for the return of winter and the continuation of the eternal rhythms that had sustained communities for countless generations.